what if the God of the Bible wasn't always the only God worshipped by ancient Israel? Long before Yahweh became the central name in biblical tradition, ancient texts and archaeology point to another powerful deity, El, the high God worshipped across the ancient Near East. So how did Yahweh rise to prominence? Did two traditions merge over time, or was an older God gradually replaced? Hidden inside biblical passages, inscriptions, and forgotten history is a story that could completely change how we understand the origins of the Bible. In this video, we explore how Yahweh became the God of the Bible and what really happened to El. There is a question buried inside the oldest texts of the Western world, a question so fundamental that its answer would reshape everything most people think they know about the origins of monotheism, the nature of the Bible, and the very identity of the God worshipped by billions of people today. The question is not whether God exists. That is a matter of faith, and faith is not on trial here. The question is historical, textual, and archaeological, and it is this: where did the God of the Bible come from? Not in a theological sense, not as a matter of divine origin, but in the sense that historians and archaeologists and linguists mean when they ask where any religious idea came from. What were the conditions, the cultures, the centuries of religious evolution that produced the figure now called God, or Yahweh, or the Lord? Because the evidence, carved into stone, pressed into clay, buried in the earth of ancient Canaan and the deserts of the Sinai, tells a story that is far more complex, far more layered, and in many ways far more fascinating than any simple account of divine revelation. It is a story of God's merging, of names being transferred, of an ancient pantheon being slowly dismantled, and its most powerful figure absorbed into a new and singular deity. It is the story of how a God named El, the patriarch of the entire Canaanite divine family, gradually fused with a God named Yahweh, a storm deity from the southern wilderness, to produce the composite, singular, all-encompassing God of the Hebrew Bible. To understand that story, you have to be willing to sit with some uncomfortable facts. The Bible itself, when read carefully and in its oldest layers, does not describe a straightforward monotheism that sprang fully formed into existence. It describes a religious world in which many gods were acknowledged to exist, in which Israel's God was initially one among several, and in which the concept of worshiping only one God, what scholars call monolatry, preceded the concept of there being only one God, what scholars call monotheism, by several centuries. The shift from a world of many gods to a world of one God was not instantaneous. It was gradual, contested, politically driven, theologically argued, and in many ways only completed during and after the catastrophe of the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. The people who wrote and compiled and edited the texts we now call the Bible were working within that long arc of transformation, and the traces of the older religious world, the world of El and his family, the world of Asherah and Baal, and a dozen other divine figures, were not entirely erased. They survive in the text itself, in place names and personal names and poetic fragments and legal codes, waiting to be read by anyone willing to look. This is not a fringe theory. This is the mainstream consensus of academic biblical scholarship, built over more than 2 centuries of careful philological, archaeological, and historical work. The scholars who have contributed to this understanding include not only secular historians and anthropologists, but deeply committed Jewish and Christian academics whose faith has not prevented them from following the evidence wherever it leads. Figures like Frank Moore Cross of Harvard, William Foxwell Albright, Mark Smith of Princeton, John Day of Oxford, Othmar Keel, Christoph Eulinger, and dozens of others have spent their careers mapping the religious evolution of ancient Israel, and what they have found is not a single, unified, unchanging religious tradition, but a spectacularly dynamic process of borrowing, transformation, conflict, and synthesis. The God who emerges from that process is no less real to those who worship him, but his history is far richer and stranger than the simplified narrative most people encounter in Sunday school or synagogue. The starting point for understanding all of this is a place and a language that most people have never heard of, Ugarit, and the language spoken there, which scholars call Ugaritic. Ugarit was an ancient city-state located on the coast of what is now Syria, near the modern city of Latakia. It flourished from roughly the 3rd millennium BCE until its sudden and total destruction around 1185 BCE, almost certainly at the hands of the mysterious Sea Peoples, whose migrations destabilized the entire eastern Mediterranean at the end of the Bronze Age. Ugarit was a cosmopolitan trading hub, a city where merchants from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Cyprus, the Aegean, and Canaan mingled and exchanged not only goods, but ideas, including religious ideas. And when it was destroyed so suddenly that everything was left in place, including, crucially, a royal library filled with clay tablets inscribed in the cuneiform script of Ugaritic, a language closely related to ancient Hebrew. Those tablets, discovered by French archaeologists beginning in 1929, contained a treasure of mythological and religious literature that transformed our understanding of ancient Canaanite religion and, by extension, of the origins of the religion of ancient Israel. What the Ugaritic texts revealed was a fully developed pantheon of gods, presided over by a deity named El, who was described in terms strikingly parallel to the descriptions of God in the Hebrew Bible. El in the Ugaritic texts is called the Father of Years, the Creator of created things, the Bull El, a title emphasizing his power and virility, and the Kindly One. He is described as dwelling on a mountain at the source of 2 rivers, surrounded by the divine council, making decisions about the fates of gods and humans. He is the father of the gods, the patriarch of the divine family, and the supreme authority in the cosmos. He is portrayed as aged and wise, a god of deliberation rather than conflict, a deity whose power is rooted not in violent action, but in the absolute authority of the patriarch. And here is what makes this extraordinary. The name El, spelled Aleph lamed in Semitic script, is one of the most common names for God in the Hebrew Bible. In the oldest poetic texts of the Hebrew Bible, El appears not as an epithet, not as a generic title, but as a personal name, the name of the deity worshipped by the patriarchs. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the earliest strands of the Hebrew tradition is called El, is given epithets that match almost precisely the epithets of the Ugaritic El, and is described in ways that suggest a direct or very close relationship to the Canaanite divine patriarch. This creates a puzzle that has occupied biblical scholars for generations. The Hebrew Bible presents itself, in its final edited form, as the story of the one God Yahweh, who chose Israel from among all peoples and revealed himself to Abraham and Moses and the prophets as the singular, exclusive deity of the cosmos. But when you strip away the editorial layers and look at the oldest material, the ancient poetry embedded in Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, and the Psalms, the peculiar divine names used in different sections of the text, the legal codes, the prophetic oracles, you find not one God but 2, or rather one God in the process of becoming the other. You find El, the ancient father of gods, and Yahweh, the storm warrior, deity from the desert. And you find the long, complex, centuries-spanning process by which these 2 figures were merged, identified, and ultimately synthesized into the singular God of later Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. To understand that process, you have to understand both figures separately, their origins, their characteristics, their worshippers, and their worlds. And to understand El, you have to go back to the beginning, to the ancient Near East before Israel existed, to the world that Israel was born into, and that shaped it in ways the Bible's final editors worked very hard to obscure. The ancient Near East is the term historians use to describe the civilizations of the region, stretching roughly from Egypt in the west to Iran in the east, and from Turkey in the north to the Arabian Peninsula in the south. This region was, for most of human history up to the modern era, the center of the world, the place where writing was invented, where cities first arose, where agriculture was systematized, where complex legal codes were developed, and where the great religions of the Western world were born. The cultures of this region, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, Egyptian, Hittite, Canaanite, Phoenician, Israelite, were not isolated from one another. They traded constantly, they fought constantly, they exchanged technology and ideas and stories and myths constantly. The religious ideas of one culture flowed into the religious ideas of another, and the gods of one people were often recognized as equivalent to or related to the gods of another people. In this environment, religious evolution was rapid, complex, and shaped as much by political events and cultural contacts as by any internal theological development. Canaan, the region that would eventually become Israel and the surrounding nations, was a particularly dynamic religious environment, located at the crossroads between Egypt to the southwest, Mesopotamia to the northeast, and the Mediterranean world to the west. Canaan was a place where religious currents from multiple directions converged and mixed. The Canaanite peoples, among whom we should include the ancestors of the Israelites, since the archaeological and textual evidence suggests that the Israelites were largely of indigenous Canaanite origin, rather than migrants from Egypt as the biblical narrative suggests, worshipped a rich and complex pantheon of deities. At the head of that pantheon stood El. Below El was his consort Asherah, the mother of the gods. Below them were the more active, more dynamic deities of the second generation: Baal, the storm god; Mot, the god of death; Yam, the god of the sea; Anat, the goddess of war, and many others. This was the religious world into which the figure of Yahweh eventually entered, and it is against this backdrop that the story of how Yahweh became the God of the Bible must be told. But before we get to Yahweh, we need to spend real time with El, because El has been so completely absorbed into the God of the Bible that most people do not realize he was ever a distinct figure. His erasure, or rather his transformation, is one of the most successful acts of religious synthesis in human history. The ancient name of God in Hebrew, El, was so thoroughly identified with Yahweh by the time the biblical texts reached their final form that most readers today do not notice that they are looking at what was once a separate deity. The compound names of God in the Bible, El Shaddai, El Elyon, El Olam, El Roy, El Bethel, which appear most frequently in the patriarchal narratives of Genesis, are not simply epithets of Yahweh. They are the names of distinct local manifestations of the Canaanite El, worshipped at different sacred sites across Canaan, and they were associated with Yahweh only gradually as the religious traditions of Israel were unified and systematized. The process by which this happened is the subject of some of the most detailed and sophisticated scholarship in the field of biblical studies, and it reveals a world of ancient Israelite religion that is almost unrecognizable from the perspective of later orthodoxy. There is one more thing to say before we dive into the deep history of El and Yahweh, and it concerns the nature of the evidence. The evidence for this reconstruction comes from three main sources: the Hebrew Bible itself, read carefully and with attention to its different literary layers and traditions; the archaeological record of ancient Canaan and Israel, which has produced inscriptions, figurines, temples, and other material evidence of religious practice; and the comparative literature of the ancient Near East, especially the Ugaritic texts, but also Phoenician, Aramaic, Akkadian, and Egyptian sources. None of these sources is simple or straightforward. The Hebrew Bible is a complex literary anthology, compiled over many centuries, edited and re-edited by scribes and priests with their own theological agendas, and not a simple historical record. The archaeological record is fragmentary and subject to ongoing revision as new discoveries are made. The comparative literature raises questions of interpretation that are still actively debated. But taken together, these three bodies of evidence paint a picture that is internally consistent and widely accepted among scholars. The God of the Bible is the product of a long evolutionary process, one that began in the polytheistic world of Canaan and passed through stages of monolatry, henotheism, and finally monotheism before reaching the form familiar to modern believers. That story is worth telling in full, with all its complexity and nuance, because it is one of the most important stories in the history of human civilization. It is the story of how the Western world's God was made. Let us begin at the very beginning, with El, the father of gods and men, the ancient patriarch of the Canaanite divine family, sitting on his mountain at the source of the rivers, surrounded by his divine council, ruling the cosmos with the authority of the original patriarch. To understand him is to understand everything that follows. El, the father of gods and men. The name El is, in one sense, the simplest word in the ancient Semitic religious vocabulary. It is the basic word for God in most Semitic languages. Cognate forms appear in Aramaic, Arabic, Akkadian, Ugaritic, and Hebrew. In Arabic, it becomes Allah, a contraction of Al-Ilah, the God. In Hebrew, it appears hundreds of times both as a common noun meaning God or divine being, and as a proper name for a specific deity. In Akkadian, the cognate Elu is similarly used both as a generic term and as a divine name. The very ubiquity of the word tells you something important. El was not originally the private deity of any one tribe or nation. He was the common heritage of the entire Western Semitic world, the shared name for the divine father figure who presided over the cosmic order from time immemorial. His antiquity is almost impossible to overstate. By the time the Ugaritic texts were being written down in the 14th and 13th centuries BCE, El was already an ancient figure, a god who belonged not to the vigorous, combative generation of younger deities, but to the primordial past, the original ordering force of the universe. In the myths of Ugarit, El does not fight cosmic battles or slay monsters or rescue cities. He thinks, decides, deliberates, and pronounces judgment. He is the ultimate authority, the final word, the cosmic patriarch whose permission is required before any significant action can be taken. The physical descriptions of El in the Ugaritic texts are strikingly consistent and remarkably parallel to later descriptions of God in the Hebrew Bible. El is consistently described as an elderly male figure with a white beard, sitting on his throne and surrounded by the members of his divine council. He is called Ab-Adem, father of humanity, and Ab-Ilm, father of the gods. He is the creator of all created things. The Ugaritic texts use the phrase Bin-Y-Bin-Wt, creator of created things, as a standard epithet. He lives in a place described as the source of the two rivers, at the meeting point of the two oceans, a cosmic geography that places him at the very center and origin of the world's waters, the source of all life. His dwelling is called the Tent of El in some texts, a detail that resonates powerfully with the tent-dwelling God of early Israel described in the biblical texts, the God who dwelt first in the tabernacle, a portable tent sanctuary in the wilderness. El's dwelling place is sometimes described as being on a mountain, Mint El in some sources, which echoes the mountain dwelling of the God of Israel, who reveals himself on Sinai and later dwells on Zion. The parallels between the Ugaritic El and the God of the early Hebrew texts are so extensive and so specific that it is essentially impossible to treat them as coincidences. The scholars who have studied these parallels most carefully, including Frank Moore Cross in his landmark 1973 work, Canaanite Myth and Hebrew Epic, have concluded that the earliest Israelite conception of their deity was essentially the conception of El, the ancient Canaanite divine patriarch, transferred to or identified with the figure of Yahweh. But to understand El properly, you need to understand the world he presided over, the Canaanite pantheon in its full complexity, and you need to understand the specific religious and social functions he performed within that world. El's role in the Canaanite divine system was not primarily that of a warrior or a weather controller or a fertility figure. His role was juridical and paternal. He was the cosmic judge and the divine father, and these two functions were intimately connected. In the patriarchal social structures of the ancient Near East, the father was also the judge, the head of the household who made binding decisions about property, marriage, warfare, and justice. El's cosmic authority was modeled on this same principle, scaled up to encompass the entire divine family, and through it, the entire cosmos. When disputes arose among the gods, they brought their cases to El. When a new situation arose that required a divine decision, whether Baal should be allowed to build a palace, whether Mot should be given dominion over the dead, whether a human king should be granted divine favor, the question was taken to El, who deliberated and pronounced judgment. This juridical function is one of the most consistent features of El across all the literary sources in which he appears, and it is a function that was transferred wholesale to Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible, where God sits in judgment over Israel and the nations, presides over the divine council, and makes binding decisions about the fates of peoples. The divine council itself is a crucial concept for understanding both El and the later development of Yahweh. In the Ugaritic texts, El presides over a council of divine beings called the Assembly of the Sons of El, or the Company of the Sons of El. This council includes all the major gods of the Canaanite pantheon, who are understood as El's sons, not in a metaphorical sense, but in the very literal sense of divine offspring, born to El by his consort, Asherah. The divine council meets regularly, deliberates on cosmic matters, and renders collective judgments, though El's authority is always supreme. The concept of a divine council presided over by the supreme deity is one of the most persistent features of ancient Near Eastern religion, appearing in Mesopotamian, Canaanite, Phoenician, and Israelite contexts. And it appears in the Hebrew Bible as well, not as a marginal or anomalous feature, but as a fully developed concept that appears in some of the Bible's most important texts. The book of Job begins with the sons of God presenting themselves before Yahweh in a clearly divine council scene. Psalm 82, one of the most theologically explosive texts in the entire Bible, opens with God standing in the divine assembly and judging among the gods, referring explicitly to other divine beings who sit in the assembly alongside the supreme deity. Isaiah 6 describes the prophet's vision of Yahweh enthroned in his heavenly court, surrounded by the seraphim. Micaiah's vision in 1 Kings 22 shows Yahweh sitting on his throne with the host of heaven standing beside him, debating how to deceive King Ahab. These divine council scenes are not vestigial metaphors or poetic licenses. They are reflections of an older, genuinely polytheistic cosmology in which Yahweh, like El before him, presided over a court of divine beings. The figure of El in the Ugaritic myths is not static or one-dimensional. He appears in several different kinds of narratives, each of which illuminates a different aspect of his character. In the Baal cycle, the great Ugaritic mythological narrative that tells the story of Baal's rise to dominance among the younger gods, El appears primarily as a judge and authority figure, the power before whom all appeals must be made. When Yam, the god of the sea, seeks permission to build a palace and establish his dominion, he appeals to El and El grants his request, much to the frustration of Baal. When Baal seeks permission to build his own palace, he must navigate the complex politics of the divine court, winning the support of El's consort Asherah before El will grant his approval. The El of the Baal cycle is a figure of enormous authority, but not particularly heroic or active. He is the patriarch who holds the ultimate power, but delegates the active work of cosmic governance to the younger, more vigorous gods of the second generation. This pattern, the ancient, sovereign, somewhat detached father god whose authority is real, but whose involvement in day-to-day cosmic affairs is mediated through younger deities, is a very common one in ancient Near Eastern religion, and it reflects the actual social structure of the patriarchal household in which the aging head of the family retained ultimate authority, even as younger family members took on the practical work of managing the estate. There is another aspect of El in the Ugaritic texts that is deeply significant for understanding the later development of Yahweh, and that is his relationship to human beings. El is not merely the father of the gods, but the father of humanity, and in several Ugaritic narratives he intervenes directly in human affairs, particularly in matters of fertility and succession. When the legendary heroes Keret and Akhet need divine help, Keret to regain his wife and produce an heir, Akhet to be blessed with good fortune, it is El who appears to them in dreams and grants their requests. El's relationship with human beings is deeply personal and paternal in character. He cares about them, he responds to their needs, he appears to them directly and speaks to them. This pattern of direct divine communication between El and human heroes, particularly in the context of dreams and visions, is strikingly parallel to the way the God of the Hebrew Bible communicates with the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. In Genesis, God appears to Abraham in a vision, speaks to him face to face, makes promises to him about land and descendants. He appears to Isaac and Jacob in dreams, speaks to them, makes covenants with them. The form and content of these divine human encounters in Genesis match the form and content of El's encounters with human heroes in the Ugaritic texts so closely that most scholars now accept that the God who communicates with the patriarchs in Genesis was originally understood to be El, and that the attribution of these encounters to Yahweh is the result of the later religious synthesis that merged El and Yahweh into a single deity. The antiquity of El's worship is also reflected in the remarkable geographic spread of his veneration across the ancient Near East. El appears not only in the Ugaritic texts, but in Phoenician inscriptions, in Aramaic texts, in Akkadian religious literature, where his equivalent is Anu, the sky god and father of the gods, in Egyptian sources, and, most importantly for our purposes, in the names of places and people throughout Canaan and ancient Israel. The Hebrew Bible is full of place names and personal names that incorporate the element El, Beth El, house of El, Peniel, face of El, Israel, he who strives with El, or possibly God strives, Daniel, El is my judge, Michael, who is like El, Gabriel, man of El, or El is my warrior, Raphael, El has healed, Uriel, El is my light, and many more. The sheer prevalence of these El names in Hebrew personal and place names, in contrast to the relative rarity of Yahweh names in the earliest strata of Israelite tradition, suggests that El was the primary deity of the early Israelite tribes and their ancestors, and that Yahweh was initially a secondary figure whose worship expanded and eventually displaced El worship among the Israelite elite, particularly the priestly and prophetic circles associated with the Jerusalem temple. The biblical evidence for El as a distinct figure from Yahweh is most clearly visible in what scholars call the documentary hypothesis, the theory, developed over 2 centuries of scholarly work, that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, is not a unified composition, but a compilation of several distinct literary sources, each with its own theological perspective, vocabulary, and historical context. The most widely accepted form of this hypothesis identifies 4 main sources: the Yahwist, J, so called because this source uses the name Yahweh for God from the very beginning of its narrative; the Elohist, E, which uses the generic name Elohim, a Hebrew plural form of El, or simply El, until the revelation of the divine name to Moses in Exodus; the Deuteronomist, D, the source behind the book of Deuteronomy and the historical books of Joshua through Kings; and the priestly source, P, which is the dominant voice in Leviticus and Numbers, and which uses Elohim exclusively before the revelation of the name Yahweh to Moses. The Elohist and priestly sources both preserve a tradition in which the divine name Yahweh was not known to the patriarchs, that it was only revealed for the first time to Moses. This tradition, preserved in Exodus 6:2-3, where God says explicitly to Moses, "I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name Yahweh I did not make myself known to them," is one of the most theologically significant statements in the entire Bible. It means that from the perspective of the Elohist and priestly traditions, the God of the patriarchs was worshipped under a different name, El Shaddai, and was only identified with Yahweh in the time of Moses. This is not a minor variation in detail. It is a fundamental divergence in theological understanding that preserves the memory of a time when El and Yahweh were distinct figures. The name El Shaddai, the name by which the priestly source says God was known to the patriarchs, is itself a fascinating enigma. The second element, Shaddai, has been interpreted in many ways as Almighty, the traditional translation, as mountain, from the Akkadian Shadu, mountain, suggesting God of the mountain, as breasts, from the Hebrew shad, breast, suggesting a connection to fertility, and as a topographic term referring to the wilderness steppe. The God of the mountain interpretation connects well with the general portrait of El as a deity who dwells on a cosmic mountain, and the mountain god characterization appears elsewhere in the biblical texts as well. Regardless of the precise etymology, El Shaddai in Genesis is clearly a deity worshipped at specific sacred places, particularly at the Oak of Mamre near Hebron, and at other sites associated with the patriarchal narratives. and the consistency with which this name appears in the patriarchal material of Genesis, combined with the priestly claim that this was the name by which God was known before the revelation of Yahweh, strongly supports the identification of the patriarchal deity with the ancient Canaanite El. El's character, as presented in both the Ugaritic texts and the early strata of the Hebrew Bible, also includes a distinctive ethical dimension that sets him apart from many other ancient Near Eastern deities. El in the Ugaritic texts is consistently described as merciful and compassionate. The text calls him LTPN, the kindly one, and describes him as responding with warmth and generosity to the appeals both of gods and of humans. He weeps for the suffering of Baal when Baal descends into the realm of death. He responds with paternal affection to the pleas of the heroes Keret and Akhat. He mediates conflicts among the gods with wisdom and patience. This ethical characterization of the supreme deity, merciful, compassionate, responsive to human need, is one of the most important inheritances that the God of the Hebrew Bible received from El. The famous self-description of Yahweh in Exodus 34:6-7, in which God proclaims himself as merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, reflects precisely the ethical profile of El, the compassionate divine father, rather than the more aggressive storm warrior profile of the original Yahweh. When the later biblical tradition attributed these qualities to Yahweh, it was in large part transferring to him the character of El, the ancient father god, whose mercy and compassion had been celebrated for centuries before Yahweh emerged as the dominant deity of Israel. The physical iconography of El, the way he was visually represented in Canaanite religious art, is another dimension of his character that deserves attention, because some of this iconography made its way into early Israelite religious practice, and was only suppressed much later, as the religion was reformed and standardized. El in Canaanite art is typically represented as a seated male figure wearing a bull's horns on his head, a sign of his virility and power. The bull is El's most important animal symbol, and the Ugaritic texts repeatedly call him the bull El. This is directly relevant to one of the most famous episodes in the Hebrew Bible, the golden calf incident in Exodus 32, in which the Israelites, impatient with Moses' absence on Mount Sinai, persuade Aaron to make them a golden calf, which they then worship as the gods who brought you out of Egypt. Aaron's declaration when presenting the calf, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt," echoes almost exactly the declaration of Jeroboam in 1 Kings 12 when he sets up two golden calves at Bethel and Dan and says, "Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." The biblical text presents both incidents as apostasy, abandonment of Yahweh in favor of false gods, but many scholars have argued that the golden calves were not meant to represent a different deity at all. They were meant to represent Yahweh, but specifically to represent Yahweh in the form of the bull, which was the iconographic symbol of El. The bull iconography of early Israelite religion was not an abandonment of the ancestral deity, but a continuation of the older El worship in which the divine patriarch was represented by his symbol, the bull. The polemical treatment of the golden calves in the final edited biblical text reflects the perspective of later reformers who had rejected all divine images entirely, not an accurate account of the religious meaning the calves had for their worshippers. The Bethel connection is particularly important here. Bethel, Beth El, House of El, was one of the most ancient and significant sacred sites in all of Canaan. It was the place where, according to Genesis, Jacob had his famous dream of the ladder connecting earth and heaven, and where he saw God and received the covenant promises. The name Bethel, El's house, indicates that this was originally a site sacred to El, and the narrative of Jacob's dream, in which the divine figure who appears and speaks to Jacob is described using El language, confirms that Bethel was an El sanctuary. When Jeroboam sets up his golden calves at Bethel and Dan in the 10th century BCE, he is not innovating. He is restoring what he presents as the ancient, legitimate form of Israelite worship at a site that has been sacred to the divine Father since time immemorial. The later condemnation of Jeroboam's calves in the Deuteronomistic history reflects the perspective of the Jerusalem establishment, which had its own political and theological reasons for condemning the northern kingdom's religious practices. But the calves themselves, at the ancient site of El's house, make perfect sense as a continuation of the indigenous Canaanite Israelite El worship that had been practiced at Bethel for centuries. One of the most remarkable pieces of evidence for El's place in early Israelite religion comes from Deuteronomy 32, in a passage known as the Song of Moses. This passage, which many scholars believe preserves some of the oldest religious poetry in the Bible, contains a reference that is theologically explosive when read in its original form. The standard Hebrew text of Deuteronomy 32:8-9 reads, "When the Most High, Elion, gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. But the Lord's, Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage." But the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, reads differently, and its reading is confirmed by a Dead Sea Scroll fragment, 4Q Diut, that preserves what scholars believe is the older version of the text. In the older version, the text reads not "sons of Israel," but "sons of El," or "sons of God," which changes the meaning dramatically. In the older version, the passage says that when the Most High, El Elyon, a title of El, divided the nations of the world among the gods, he allocated one nation to each god, and Yahweh's portion was Israel. This means that in the older version of the text, Yahweh is not the supreme deity El Elyon, but a subordinate deity who receives Israel as his allotted portion from the chief god El. This is not monotheism. It is not even monolatry. It is a fully polytheistic conception in which Yahweh is one God among many, each assigned a nation to rule, all of them subordinate to El, the supreme patriarch of the divine family. The implications of this are staggering. One of the oldest texts in the Bible preserves the memory of a time when Yahweh was not the supreme God, but a member of El's divine council who received Israel as his particular domain. The later scribes who produced the Masoretic text, the standard Hebrew text, changed sons of El to sons of Israel, effectively eliminating the polytheistic implications of the original, but the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint preserve the older reading. This single passage, more than almost any other, encapsulates the entire trajectory from polytheism to monotheism that is the subject of this investigation. El, then, was the supreme deity of the ancient Canaanite world, a figure of enormous antiquity, compassion, and cosmic authority, worshipped under various names and epithets across the entire ancient Near East, and preserved in the earliest strata of Israelite tradition as the original deity of the patriarchs. His character, his epithets, his myths, his iconography, and his ethical profile all left deep marks on the portrait of God in the Hebrew Bible. Understanding El is the prerequisite for understanding everything that follows: how Yahweh emerged, how the two figures were identified and merged, and how the God of the Bible took the form that billions of people have worshipped ever since. To understand that process, we need to turn now to El's full divine family, the Canaanite pantheon in its entirety, because the gods who surrounded El, who competed with and complemented him, who were eventually absorbed into or erased by the biblical synthesis, are every bit as important to the story as El himself. The Canaanite pantheon, El's divine family. The Canaanite pantheon was not a random collection of deities. It was a structured hierarchical family with El at its head and his divine offspring, and their rivals and enemies spread across the cosmic landscape in a complex web of relationships, conflicts, and alliances. Understanding this divine family is essential for understanding the Hebrew Bible, because the traces of these gods are everywhere in the biblical text. In the names of angels, in the characteristics attributed to Yahweh, in the stories told about the divine council, in the legal prohibitions against the worship of specific deities, and in the archaeological remains of Israelite religious practice. The Canaanite gods did not simply disappear when Israel declared its allegiance to Yahweh alone. They were transformed, absorbed, suppressed, demonized, and in some cases almost entirely erased. but the traces of their existence remain, visible to those who know where to look. At the center of the divine family, alongside El, was his consort, Asherah. The relationship between El and Asherah in the Ugaritic texts is the foundational relationship of the entire divine order, the cosmic marriage from which the other gods are born. Asherah in the Ugaritic texts is called Rabtu Asherati Yami, Lady Asherah of the Sea, and she is described as the mother of 70 gods, the 70 sons of El and Asherah who make up the full complement of the divine council. She is a figure of enormous power and influence, not merely a passive consort, but an active political figure who mediates between the younger gods and El, who negotiates on behalf of Baal when he seeks El's permission to build his palace, and who intervenes in divine disputes with her own authority. The relationship between El and Asherah is depicted in the Ugaritic texts as one of genuine partnership and mutual respect. El listens to Asherah, defers to her judgment in some matters, and treats her as a full partner in the governance of the cosmos. This stands in interesting contrast to the later biblical treatment of Asherah, who appears in the Hebrew Bible primarily as an object of prohibited worship, a goddess whose sacred poles, Asherim, are repeatedly condemned by the prophets and law codes and ordered to be destroyed. Yet Asherah was not simply a foreign intrusion into Israelite religion. The evidence, both textual and archaeological, makes it very clear that Asherah was worshipped in ancient Israel for centuries, and that she was specifically associated not with foreign gods, but with Yahweh himself as his divine consort. The evidence for the Asherah-Yahweh pairing comes from several directions. Most dramatically, it comes from two collections of inscriptions discovered at two sites: Kuntilet Ajrud in the Sinai Peninsula, dated to approximately 800 BCE, and Khirbet el-Qam near Hebron, dated to roughly the same period. The Kuntilet Ajrud inscriptions, found on large pottery jars called pithoi and on plaster walls, include several formulaic blessings that invoke Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah, and Yahweh of Taman and his Asherah. The use of the possessive his Asherah in connection with Yahweh is extraordinary. It means that at this period, the 9th century BCE, long after the establishment of the Israelite monarchy and well into what the Bible presents as the period of monotheistic Yahwism, at least some Israelites understood Asherah as Yahweh's divine consort, his female counterpart, in the same way that Asherah was El's consort in the Canaanite tradition. The Khirbet el-Qam inscription similarly contains a blessing formula invoking Yahweh and his Asherah, confirming that this pairing was not an isolated or regional oddity, but a widespread religious understanding in pre-exilic Israel. The archaeological evidence complements this textual evidence. Female figurines, pillar-base figurines with prominent breasts long associated with Asherah, have been found in enormous numbers at Israelite sites, including Jerusalem itself, in contexts that suggest domestic and possibly official religious use. They are so common that they cannot be dismissed as marginal or heterodox. They represent a major element of Israelite religious practice, one that was subsequently condemned and suppressed by the reforming Deuteronomists, but that clearly flourished for centuries before the Reform. The textual evidence within the Hebrew Bible for Asherah's prominence in Israelite religion is equally striking. The biblical text explicitly states that Asherah poles, wooden pillars representing the goddess, perhaps stylized sacred trees, were present in the temple in Jerusalem itself. 2 Kings 21:7 says that King Manasseh placed a carved image of Asherah in the temple, and the 2 Kings 23:4 describes how the reforming King Josiah had to remove from the temple all the vessels made for Baal, for Asherah, and for all the host of heaven. The host of heaven, the sun, moon, and stars worshipped as divine beings, were another element of the temple cult that Josiah's reform sought to eliminate. The prophet Jeremiah, writing in this same period, describes women in Jerusalem making offerings to the Queen of Heaven, almost certainly a title of Asherah, and baking special cakes in her image, a practice the women explicitly describe as having been carried on by our fathers and our kings and our officials in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. These women do not describe the worship of Asherah as an innovation or a foreign intrusion. They describe it as the traditional practice of their ancestors, something that had been done for generations before the Reform tried to abolish it. When the prophet tries to condemn them, they push back vigorously, arguing that things were better when they worshipped the Queen of Heaven and worse when they stopped. This is not the behavior of people who have abandoned a foreign goddess for the ancestral god. This is the behavior of people defending what they understand as the ancestral religion against the innovations of the reformers. The role of Asherah in the Canaanite pantheon was not limited to her relationship with El. She was also a powerful independent deity, a mother goddess, a goddess of the sea and of fertility, the mother of the divine family. But her most theologically significant role for our purposes is as the partner of El and then of Yahweh. The pairing of the supreme male deity with a divine female consort was absolutely standard in the ancient Near East. Virtually every major male deity had a corresponding female partner. Enlil and Ninlil in Sumerian religion, Marduk and Zarpanitu in Babylonian religion, Baal and Anat, or Astarte, in Canaanite religion, Amun and Mut in Egyptian religion. The idea that the supreme god would be alone, without a divine consort, without a feminine counterpart, was theologically unusual in the ancient world. The insistence on Yahweh's aloneness, his radical singularity, his rejection of any divine partner, was one of the great theological innovations of the later biblical tradition, and it was achieved not without a fight. The prophets' repeated condemnations of Asherah worship, the Deuteronomic law code's prohibitions against the Asherim, Josiah's violent reform, all of these are evidence of how long and how hard the struggle to establish Yahweh's exclusive sovereignty was, and how deeply rooted the alternative tradition was. After Asherah, the most theologically significant member of the Canaanite divine family for understanding the Bible is Baal, specifically Baal Hadad, the storm god, the lord of rain and lightning, the deity whose name means simply Lord. Baal in the Ugaritic texts is the most vigorous and dramatic of the gods, the hero of the great mythological narrative called the Baal cycle, which tells the story of his battles against his cosmic enemies Yam, the sea, and Mot, death, his death and resurrection, and his eventual establishment as the king of the gods under El's ultimate authority. Baal is a god of storms, of rain, of the fertility that comes with rain, and of the dramatic, dynamic forces of nature, lightning, thunder, wind. He is the divine warrior, the cosmic champion who fights the monsters of chaos and disorder so that the world of order and life can be maintained. In Canaanite religion, Baal was enormously popular precisely because his concerns were so immediately relevant to the lives of farmers and herders who depended on the seasonal rains for their crops and livestock. He was the deity who made the difference between life and death in an agricultural economy, the one who brought the autumn rains, who defeated the dragon of the sea's destructive power, who came back from death each spring to revitalize the earth. His worship was practiced throughout Canaan and spread far beyond it, to Ugarit, to Phoenicia, to Egypt, where he was identified with the storm aspects of Seth, and to the Aegean. Baal's presence in Israelite religion is one of the most extensively documented facts in both the biblical text and the archaeological record. The Bible refers to Baal worship among the Israelites dozens of times, treating it as a recurring apostasy, a falling away from Yahweh to a foreign god. The prophets Elijah, Hosea, and Jeremiah all combat Baal worship explicitly, and the Deuteronomistic history structures its entire narrative of Israelite history around the cycle of apostasy to Baal and return to Yahweh. But a careful reading of the evidence suggests that the relationship between Yahweh and Baal was far more complex than simple apostasy and return. In some important ways, many Israelites may not have experienced the worship of Baal as apostasy at all, because they did not draw a sharp distinction between Baal and Yahweh, or rather, because they worshipped Yahweh using language and imagery that originally belonged to Baal. The storm deity characteristics of Yahweh, his association with thunder and lightning, his appearance in clouds, his control over rain and weather, his role as divine warrior who defeats the forces of chaos, are all characteristics that belong originally to Baal in the Canaanite mythological tradition. When the Psalms describe Yahweh riding on the clouds, Psalm 68:4, 104:3, or sending his lightning bolts, Psalm 77:18, 97:4, or causing the mountains to melt with his presence, Psalm 97:5. They are using the exact same language and imagery that the Ugaritic texts use for Baal. In fact, several passages in the Psalms have such close verbal parallels with Baal texts from Ugarit that scholars have concluded they were either adapted directly from existing Baal hymns or composed in deliberate imitation of the Baal literary tradition. This means that Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible absorbed not only the characteristics of El, the patriarch, the father, the divine judge, but also, to a significant extent, the characteristics of Baal, the storm warrior, the rainbringer, the cosmic champion. This double absorption gave Yahweh a theological richness and versatility that neither El nor Baal possessed independently. He was simultaneously the ancient, wise, compassionate divine father and the vigorous, dynamic, powerful storm warrior. He was both the cosmic patriarch who ruled from his heavenly throne and the warrior deity who fought battles on behalf of his people. This combination of characteristics, derived from two very different divine models, is one of the reasons why the God of the Hebrew Bible is such a complex and compelling figure, simultaneously transcendent and immanent, wrathful and merciful, distant and intimately involved in human affairs. He is a synthesis of divine archetypes, and that synthesis was achieved through centuries of religious evolution. The conflict between Yahweh and Baal in the biblical narrative is most dramatically represented in the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel in 1 Kings 18. The famous contest in which Elijah challenges the 450 prophets of Baal to call down fire from heaven onto their altar with the understanding that the God who responds is the true God. The prophets of Baal cry out from morning to noon, cut themselves with swords and spears, and rave all afternoon, and nothing happens. Elijah taunts them, "Cry aloud, for he is a God." Either he is musing, or he is relieving himself, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened. Then Elijah calls on Yahweh, and fire descends and consumes not only the offering, but the altar, the water poured over it, and even the stones of the altar itself. The text uses this story to establish definitively that Yahweh, not Baal, is the true God, that Yahweh is the one who truly controls the forces of storm and fire. The Elijah narrative is fascinating precisely because it engages so directly with the Baal tradition. The contest is over exactly the domain, control of fire, storm, and rain. That was Baal's defining characteristic. Yahweh does not defeat Baal on some foreign ground. He defeats him on his own territory, demonstrating that he, Yahweh, is the true master of the storm. This competitive dynamic, Yahweh claiming for himself the very functions and powers that defined Baal, is one of the mechanisms by which the storm deity characteristics of Baal were absorbed into Yahweh's profile. The figure of Mot, the god of death, is another member of the Canaanite divine family whose traces can be detected in the Hebrew Bible, though his absorption into the biblical worldview was of a different kind than that of El or Baal. In the Ugaritic texts, Mot is one of El's sons, the lord of the realm of the dead, Sheol in the later biblical terminology, and Baal's most dangerous enemy. The great narrative of the Baal cycle culminates in Baal's descent into Mot's realm, his death, and his eventual resurrection and return to the world of the living. The death and resurrection cycle of Baal is closely connected to the seasonal cycle of agriculture. Baal's death corresponds to the summer dry season when the land is parched and the crops are dead, and his resurrection corresponds to the autumn rains that bring new life to the earth. This mythological pattern, the dying and rising of the fertility god, his defeat of death, his return from the underworld, is one of the most widespread in ancient Near Eastern religion. It appears in the Sumerian myth of Inanna's descent to the underworld, in the Babylonian epic of Tammuz, in the Ugaritic Baal cycle, and in various Egyptian myths, including the Osiris cycle. It does not appear in precisely this form in the Hebrew Bible. The later biblical tradition firmly resisted the idea of a dying and rising deity, but its influence can be felt in the vivid descriptions of Yahweh's combat with the forces of chaos and death, in the Psalms' imagery of descent to Sheol and rescue by God, and in the late prophetic texts that speak of a future resurrection of the dead. The engagement of the biblical tradition with these mythological patterns is evidence not of simple borrowing, but of a complex process of acceptance, transformation, and rejection, in which some elements of the Canaanite mythological world were absorbed into the biblical tradition, while others were firmly excluded. Yam, the sea god, Mot's counterpart as a divine enemy of Baal, also left traces in the Hebrew Bible. In the Ugaritic texts, Baal's battle against Yam, the lord of the chaotic sea and the rivers, is one of the central episodes in the divine narrative. Baal defeats Yam with two magical clubs made by the craftsman god Kothar Wakasis, subduing the chaotic waters and establishing cosmic order. This battle with the chaotic sea, the primordial waters that threaten to overwhelm the ordered world, is a mythological theme that runs through the entire ancient Near East, from the Babylonian Enuma Elish, in which Marduk defeats Tiamat, the saltwater dragon, to the Ugaritic Baal cycle to the Hebrew Bible. In the Hebrew Bible, Yahweh is repeatedly described as the one who subdued the primordial waters, who fought and defeated the sea monster, called Leviathan or Rahab in biblical texts, and established order out of chaos. Psalm 74 says, "You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan." Psalm 89 declares, "You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. You crushed Rahab like a carcass." Isaiah 51:9-10 addresses Yahweh with the words, "Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep?" These texts use the same mythological vocabulary as the Ugaritic Baal texts, the same sea monster imagery, the same language of divine combat, the same establishment of cosmic order through the defeat of chaotic waters. What has changed is only the identity of the divine warrior. It is no longer Baal who defeats Yam, but Yahweh who defeats Yam, Leviathan, Rahab. The mythological pattern has been preserved, but transferred to a new divine protagonist. The transfer of Baal's combat mythology to Yahweh was not simply a matter of literary borrowing. It was a theologically purposeful move that served the larger project of establishing Yahweh's exclusive sovereignty. By claiming for Yahweh the cosmic deeds that had previously been attributed to Baal, the defeat of chaos, the control of storm and rain, the rescue of the world from primordial dissolution, the authors and compilers of the biblical texts were arguing that Baal had never actually possessed these powers at all. Yahweh, they argued, had always been the true master of the cosmos. The Canaanites who credited these deeds to Baal were simply wrong. This is a recognizable pattern in the history of religions. When one religion displaces another, it often does so not by simply rejecting the previous religion's mythology, but by claiming that mythology for its own deity, arguing that the previous worshippers were mistaken about who had really done these great deeds. The effect is to absorb the mythological and emotional power of the older tradition while simultaneously delegitimizing the older deity. It is, in essence, what happened to El. His characteristics, his titles, his mythology, and his worshippers were absorbed by Yahweh, while El himself was demoted from an independent deity to a name and set of epithets for Yahweh. And it is what happened, less completely, but still substantially, to Baal. His storm mythology, his combat narrative, his connection to rain and fertility were all absorbed by Yahweh, while Baal himself was demonized as the archetypal false god, the paradigmatic example of idolatrous apostasy. The goddess Anat deserves a brief mention in this context because her fate in the biblical tradition illustrates yet another mechanism of divine absorption, degendering, and redistribution. Anat in the Ugaritic texts is the goddess of war and hunting, a fierce, bloodthirsty divine warrior who wades through her enemies with such enthusiasm that the texts describe her wading in blood up to her knees, with severed heads hanging at her waist. She is also Baal's closest ally, and in some texts, his lover or sister, the one who retrieves him from the realm of death and fights to restore him to life. Anat's warlike qualities do not appear in the Hebrew Bible as a distinct divine figure, unlike El and Baal and Asherah, who all have explicit references in the biblical text. Anat appears only as a place name, Anathoth, the home of Jeremiah, and as a possible theophoric element in personal names. But her warlike qualities, the divine warrior who fights on behalf of the chosen, were not simply abandoned. They were absorbed into the profile of Yahweh himself, who in the early military poetry of the Bible is above all a divine warrior, a god of armies whose power is demonstrated precisely in battle. The Song of the Sea in Exodus 15, which scholars generally regard as one of the oldest texts in the Bible, celebrates Yahweh in language that is almost purely martial. Yahweh is a man of war. Yahweh is his name. The divine warrior archetype in the Hebrew Bible draws on the same tradition that produced Anat and Baal, and its presence in the characterization of Yahweh is another mark of the Canaanite religious heritage that shaped the God of Israel. The figure of Kothar Wakasis, the craftsman deity, the divine smith and builder, the maker of Baal's magical weapons and Baal's palace, also left a trace in the biblical tradition, though a subtle one. In the Ugaritic texts, Kothar is the god who creates the instruments of divine power, weapons, buildings, magical objects, and who alone has the skill and knowledge to build the divine palace. This divine craftsman figure has a counterpart in the Hebrew Bible in the figure of the divine creator, the God who built the cosmos with wisdom and skill, Proverbs 8:22-31, where wisdom is present at the creation as a craftsman. The architectural language used of creation in the biblical texts, the foundations of the earth, the pillars of heaven, the tent of the sky, reflects the same tradition of divine craftsmanship that produced Kothar in Ugaritic mythology. What emerges from this survey of the Canaanite divine family is a picture of extraordinary religious richness, a complex, interrelated system of divine figures who between them covered every dimension of cosmic and human experience, creation and destruction, order and chaos, fertility and death, war and wisdom, justice and compassion. The Hebrew Bible did not reject this entire system. It engaged with it, absorbed much of it, contested some of it, and ultimately resolved the tension by attributing all of these divine qualities and functions to a single deity, Yahweh. That attribution was the work of centuries, and it was never entirely complete. The traces of the older divine family remain visible in the text. To understand how this process of absorption and synthesis worked in practice, we need to move from the world of Ugaritic mythology to the world of early Israelite history, to ask who Yahweh was before he became the supreme God of all and where he came from. The answer to that question is surprising, and it takes us south, deep into the desert, to the wilderness south of Canaan, to the land of Midian and Edom and the Sinai, where a desert deity with a personal name and a volcanic temperament was preparing to make his entrance into history. Yahweh's origins, the God from the south. Who was Yahweh before he became the God of Israel? This is a question that strikes most people as strange or even unanswerable. The idea that there was a before for the deity who, in the theological system of the Hebrew Bible, has always existed, who is eternal and uncreated and beyond the categories of time and origin. But the question is entirely answerable in historical terms, and the answer is one of the most fascinating in all of religious history. Yahweh did not begin as the supreme God of the cosmos. He began as a regional deity, a deity specifically associated with a particular geographic area south of Canaan in the wilderness regions of the Sinai Peninsula, the Negev, Edom, and the land of Midian. He was, in origin, a god of the southern desert and mountain, a deity of storm and fire, and perhaps of volcanic phenomena, who was worshipped by the nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples of the southern wilderness before he became, through a complex process of migration, adoption, and religious evolution, the chief deity of the Israelite tribes, and eventually the only god of the Western world. The evidence for this origin is multiple and converging, drawn from the geographical references in the oldest biblical poetry, from comparative analysis with other ancient Near Eastern sources, from the structure of the Exodus narrative, and from the figure of Moses, who in the biblical narrative encounters Yahweh for the first time, not in Canaan, but in the wilderness, far to the south, at the mountain of God, in the land of Midian. The single most important piece of evidence for Yahweh's southern origin is a cluster of very ancient texts in the Hebrew Bible that consistently locate Yahweh in the same geographic region, the south and southeast of Canaan, in the wilderness zone that encompasses the Sinai Peninsula, the Negev, Edom, Paran, Seir, and Teman. These texts include some of the oldest poetry in the entire Bible, compositions that scholars date to the 12th and 11th centuries BCE or even earlier, considerably older than most of the prose narrative of the Pentateuch. Deuteronomy 33, the blessing of Moses, opens with these words, "Yahweh came from Sinai and dawned from Seir upon us. He shone forth from Mount Paran." Judges 5, the Song of Deborah, which is widely considered one of the oldest texts in the Bible, says, "Yahweh, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the region of Edom, the earth trembled, and the heavens poured, and the clouds dripped with water." Psalm 68, another archaic poem, says, "O God, when you went out before your people, when you marched through the wilderness, the earth quaked, the heavens poured down rain, before God, the one of Sinai." Habakkuk 3, a theophany poem of great antiquity, says, "God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise." In every one of these texts, Yahweh's natural habitat, the place he comes from, the place where he dwells before he marches out to help his people, is the wilderness south of Canaan, Sinai, Seir, Edom, Paran, Teman, the vast and forbidding desert wilderness that stretches from the Negev southward to the Gulf of Aqaba and westward to the Sinai Peninsula. This geographic consistency is not accidental. These texts are not describing a single historical event. They are using the language of divine warrior mythology, in which the deity marches out from his mountain abode to fight on behalf of his people. The mountain from which Yahweh comes in these texts is his home, the place where he dwells, and that home is consistently located in the south, in the region associated with the tribal groups who lived on the margins of Canaan: the Edomites, the Midianites, the Kenites, the Amalekites, and other desert peoples. This constellation of evidence has led the majority of scholars who have studied the question to conclude that Yahweh originated in the worship of these southern peoples, that he was a deity known and worshipped in the desert south before he was adopted by the Israelite tribes. The question of exactly which group was originally responsible for Yahweh's worship and exactly how and when Yahweh was adopted by Israel is debated in detail, but the broad consensus is clear. Yahweh came from the south, from the wilderness, from the desert margins of Canaan. Not from Canaan itself, and not from Mesopotamia, but from the wild southern lands that the Canaanite city-states regarded as barbarous wilderness. The name Yahweh itself is one of the most discussed and debated topics in all of biblical scholarship, and any serious investigation of Yahweh's origins must engage with the question of what this name means. The name is spelled in Hebrew with 4 consonants, Yod, Ha, Vav, Ha, which scholars conventionally transliterate as YHWH, and which are known as the Tetragrammaton, Greek for 4 letters. The pronunciation of this name was considered so sacred in later Jewish tradition that it ceased to be spoken aloud. Instead, readers would substitute the word Adonai, Lord, when they encountered the Tetragrammaton in the text, which is why most English Bible translations render it simply as the Lord in capital letters. The original pronunciation of the name is not known with absolute certainty, but most scholars accept the vocalization Yahweh based on several ancient sources that preserve what appear to be the original vowels, including early Greek transliterations, such as Yab in Theodore and Yahweh in Clement of Alexandria, and the abbreviated form Yah or Yahu that appears in personal names and in the exclamation Hallelujah, praise Yah. The meaning of the name Yahweh is explained in the Bible itself in Exodus 3:14, the famous passage in which God reveals his name to Moses at the burning bush. When Moses asks for God's name, God replies in Hebrew, Ehyeh asher ehyeh, I am who I am, or I will be what I will be, and then says, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And then in verse 15 he gives the name Yahweh and says that this is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. The Hebrew word Yahweh is grammatically understood in this context as a form of the verb haya, to be, specifically the causative form, meaning he who causes to be or he who brings into existence. This interpretation, which identifies Yahweh as the one who brings being into existence, became the foundation of later philosophical monotheism's understanding of God as the self-existent, self-sustaining ground of all being. But scholars have debated whether this interpretation is original or whether it is a theological retrospective, an explanation provided by later scribes who were working with a name whose original meaning had been forgotten or whose original context was the wilderness religion of a people with whom Israel had ancient connections. There is an Egyptian source that may provide an important clue about the earliest known mention of the name Yahweh or something closely related to it. Egyptian inscriptions from the Temple of Amun at Soleb and from Amara West in Nubia, dating to the reign of Amenhotep III in the 14th century BCE and to the period of Ramesses II in the 13th century BCE respectively, contain references to a geographic region associated with the nomadic Shasu people, a term the Egyptians used for the desert nomads of the southern Levant and Sinai, and in these inscriptions appears the phrase, the land of the Shasu of YHW. The letters YHW are almost certainly a form of the name Yahweh. They are the same three consonants, and the geographic context, the land of the Shasu nomads in the region south of Canaan, matches exactly the geographic evidence from the oldest biblical poetry. What this inscription suggests is that the name Yahweh was associated with a specific group of desert nomads in the southern Levant region at least as early as the 14th century BCE, before the Israelite monarchy, before the Exodus narrative as the Bible presents it, before any of the events traditionally associated with the revelation of Yahweh to Moses. This does not mean that Yahweh did not reveal himself to Moses. That is a matter of theology, not history. What it means historically is that the name Yahweh and its association with the southern desert were established features of the regional religious landscape before the Israelite tribes adopted Yahweh as their deity. The connection between Yahweh and the Midianites is another crucial element of the historical reconstruction. In the biblical narrative, Moses encounters Yahweh for the first time in the land of Midian, where he has taken refuge after fleeing Egypt. He marries the daughter of a Midianite priest named Jethro, also called Ruel or Hobab in different textual strands, and it is while tending the flocks of his father-in-law near Horeb, the mountain of God, that Moses encounters the burning bush and receives the revelation of the divine name, the mountain of God, whether identified with Sinai or Horeb, and the relationship between these two mountain names is itself a complex textual question, is consistently described as being in or near the land of Midian in the wilderness south of Canaan. Moses' father-in-law Jethro is described as a priest, not a Midianite chieftain or a secular leader, but a religious specialist, a priest of the gods of Midian. And in Exodus 18, after the exodus from Egypt, Jethro comes to Moses in the wilderness and performs a remarkable act. He offers burnt offerings and sacrifices to God, Elohim in this text, and he leads Moses and the elders of Israel in a communal meal in the presence of God. The text says explicitly, and Jethro rejoiced for all the good that Yahweh had done to Israel. Some scholars have read this passage as suggesting that Jethro, the Midianite priest, was already a worshiper of Yahweh, that it was the Midianites who introduced Moses, and through him the Israelites to the worship of Yahweh. This theory, known as the Canaanite hypothesis, after the Kenites, a subgroup of the Midianites who appear to have been particularly close to Israel, has been debated since it was first proposed in the 19th century, but it remains one of the most persuasive explanations for the Midianite setting of the initial Yahweh revelation and for the prominent role of Jethro in the early Exodus narrative. The Canaanite hypothesis holds that Yahweh was originally the deity of the Kenites, a metalworking, nomadic people associated with the Midianites who are described in the Bible as having a particularly close relationship with Israel. The Kenites are described as descendants of Hobab, Moses' brother-in-law, and a Kenite named Heber appears in the narrative of the Battle of Kishon in the era of Deborah, with his wife Jael, who kills the Canaanite general Sisera. The Kenites are consistently portrayed in the Bible as friendly to Israel, as sharing Israel's God, and as living in close proximity to the Israelite tribes. If the Kenites were the original worshippers of Yahweh, a deity associated with the southern desert, with metalworking, fire and smithing being closely connected in the ancient mind, and with the volcanic or storm phenomena of the wilderness, then Moses' encounter with Yahweh in the land of Midian was not a first revelation, but an encounter with a deity already known to the people of that region, and the Israelites' adoption of Yahweh was facilitated by their long association with the Kenites. This would explain why the biblical narrative consistently locates the mountain of God in the southern wilderness, why Moses' father-in-law is a priest of that region, and why the Kenites throughout the biblical narrative are portrayed as sharing in Israel's religious life without being members of the covenant people. But Yahweh's original character in the desert traditions is not merely a matter of geographic location, it is also a matter of the kind of deity he was. And here, the evidence is clear that the original Yahweh was a very different kind of God from the ancient, patriarchal, compassionate El. Yahweh in the oldest texts is above all a God of power, raw, overwhelming, sometimes terrifying divine power. He manifests in fire and smoke and earthquake and storm. The theophany at Sinai in Exodus 19 describes the mountain wrapped in smoke, trembling violently, with thunder and lightning and the sound of trumpets blasting louder and louder, so that the people who see it are overwhelmed with terror and beg Moses to speak to God on their behalf because they cannot bear the direct presence of the divine. This is not the El of the Ugaritic texts, who appears to human heroes in calm dreams and speaks to them in measured, compassionate tones. This is a deity of volcanic intensity, of overwhelming presence, a deity before whom ordinary human beings cannot stand without being destroyed. The word holy in the early Israelite tradition carries precisely this meaning. The holiness of Yahweh is not primarily an ethical quality, but an ontological one, a quality of raw divine power that is lethal to human contact, that must be carefully managed through ritual and distance and purification, lest it consume those who approach it without proper preparation. The dietary prohibitions, the ritual purity codes, the elaborate architecture of the tabernacle, and later the temple, all of these can be understood partly as the infrastructure of approach to a deity of this kind, a deity whose power is so overwhelming that special precautions are necessary before human beings can enter the divine presence without being destroyed. The story of Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus 10, who are consumed by fire when they offer strange fire before Yahweh, is an example of this deadly holiness in action. The story of Uzzah in 2 Samuel 6, who reaches out to steady the Ark of the Covenant when it wobbles on the cart and is immediately struck dead by Yahweh for touching it, is another. These stories reflect a conception of the divine that is much more characteristic of a desert storm and fire deity than of the compassionate, deliberate El. And this same raw, consuming divine power is what makes Yahweh, in contrast to El, a god of war. The Ark of the Covenant, which is Yahweh's throne or footstool or portable sanctuary in the wilderness and early monarchy periods, is explicitly described as a war palladium, a divine object carried into battle that gives Israel's army supernatural power and whose mere presence is enough to throw enemies into panic. Rise up, O Yahweh, let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you. Moses shouts when the ark sets out on the march. This is the language of a divine warrior, a god whose primary function in his original context was to fight, to destroy enemies, to protect his people through divine violence, to demonstrate his power through acts of decisive, overwhelming force. The merger of El's characteristics with Yahweh's characteristics was, in this sense, a merger of two very different divine personalities. El was the ancient, wise, compassionate Father God of the entire cosmos. Yahweh was the intense, fiery, terrifying warrior deity of the desert and the tribe. El governed the cosmos through wisdom and decree. Yahweh governed through power and command. El's relationship with human beings was paternal and nurturing. Yahweh's was demanding and fierce. El presided over a divine family. Yahweh demanded exclusive allegiance and tolerated no rivals. These are not the characteristics of the same deity. They are the characteristics of two very different religious personalities, shaped by very different social and environmental contexts. And yet, in the crucible of early Israelite religion, they were merged into one. The God who is simultaneously the cosmic father and the divine warrior, the compassionate creator and the jealous sovereign, the ancient patriarch and the terrifying presence on the mountain. This merger is one of the great creative acts in the history of religion, and it produced a deity of extraordinary theological power and complexity. But to understand how it happened, we need to look more carefully at the specific historical and archaeological evidence for early Israelite religion, at the picture that emerges from the ground itself, from the objects and inscriptions and temple remains that the ancient Israelites left behind. Early Israel and its gods. What archaeology tells us. The archaeology of ancient Israel has transformed our understanding of Israelite religion in ways that are still being fully absorbed by both scholars and the general public. What the ground has yielded over the past century of systematic excavation is a picture of early Israelite religious practice that is both more diverse and more continuous with Canaanite religion than the biblical text, in its final edited form, suggests. The Israelites who lived in the highlands of Canaan during the Iron Age, the period roughly corresponding to the emergence of the Israelite kingdoms in the 12th through 10th centuries BCE, were not, for the most part, strict monotheists who worshipped Yahweh alone and rejected all other divine figures. They were inhabitants of a world thick with divine presences, a world in which the sacred was not concentrated in one place or one deity, but dispersed across the landscape in high places and sacred groves and household shrines and local sanctuaries. And the material remains of this world, the figurines, the altars, the inscriptions, the temple remains, tell a story that the Bible's editors worked hard to suppress but could not entirely erase. The question of where the Israelites came from, and therefore what their original religious heritage was, has been one of the most contested issues in biblical archaeology over the past century. The traditional biblical account presents the Israelites as a people who came from outside Canaan, descended from Abraham who migrated from Mesopotamia, enslaved in Egypt, liberated under Moses, and then entering Canaan from the outside under Joshua in a dramatic military conquest. This narrative has been subjected to intense archaeological scrutiny, and the picture that has emerged from decades of excavation is considerably more complicated. The large-scale military conquest described in the book of Joshua has found essentially no archaeological confirmation. The cities supposedly destroyed by Joshua in the conquest show no evidence of destruction at the times the biblical chronology requires, and several of them, including Jericho and Ai, were either unoccupied or very sparsely settled during the period when the conquest is supposed to have occurred. The archaeologists William Deaver, Israel Finkelstein, and many others have argued that the actual process by which the Israelites settled the highlands of Canaan was far more gradual and far less violent than the biblical narrative suggests, a process involving the transformation of existing Canaanite populations rather than their replacement by an invading group from outside. The most significant archaeological indicator of the emergence of Israelite culture in the highlands of Canaan is the appearance, beginning around 1200 BCE, of a new type of settlement in the central hill country. Small, unfortified villages characterized by a distinctive material culture. These villages are identified as Israelite not because of any written evidence, but because they share characteristics, including four-room house plans, collar-rim storage jars, and the absence of pig bones that distinguish them from the Canaanite culture of the lowland cities and coastal plains. The absence of pig bones is particularly significant. The prohibition on eating pork, which is mandated in the biblical law codes, appears to have been practiced in these highland settlements from their earliest phase, while the Canaanite lowland sites routinely show pig remains in their food waste. This dietary distinction suggests that the highland settlers, whoever they were and wherever they came from, had a distinct cultural identity that included specific food prohibitions. an identity marker that would become one of the defining features of Israelite religion. But the same sites also show material culture that is largely continuous with Canaanite tradition. Similar pottery styles, similar agricultural practices, similar house forms, suggesting that the highland settlers were not invaders from outside Canaan, but people who emerged from the existing Canaanite cultural matrix, whether through migration from the lowlands, through the coalescence of various marginal groups, including possibly some who had experienced Egypt, or through some other process of ethnogenesis. The religious material from these early Iron Age highland sites is sparse. These were small, poor villages without large temples or elaborate cult installations. But what has been found is consistent with the picture of a people whose religious practice was rooted in the Canaanite tradition. Female figurines, the pillar-base figurines already mentioned in connection with Asherah, are present from the very earliest Israelite settlements and continue to be found throughout the Iron Age. These figurines, depicting a female figure with prominent breasts, have been found in enormous numbers across Israelite sites. Over 1,000 have been cataloged from Iron Age Israelite contexts, and their ubiquity suggests that the veneration of a divine female figure, whether Asherah or a related deity, was a standard feature of Israelite domestic religion throughout the period of the monarchy. The fact that they are found in domestic contexts, houses, courtyards, domestic refuse, rather than primarily in official temple settings, suggests that this was not a marginal or deviant practice, but a central element of household religious life, practiced by ordinary families across the country. Whatever the official religious establishment was promoting, ordinary Israelite families were bringing female divine figures into their homes and venerating them. The cult stands of Tanakh, bronze stands found at the Canaanite Israelite city of Tanakh, provide another important window into the religious world of early Israel. These elaborately decorated bronze stands, dating to the 10th century BCE, are decorated with imagery that has been interpreted as depicting alternating representations of Yahweh and Asherah. One register shows a cherub flanking an empty space, the empty space perhaps representing the aniconic, imageless Yahweh, whose presence is indicated by the cherub throne, but who himself has no image. The next register shows a stylized tree flanked by ibexes, a standard symbol of Asherah in Canaanite iconography. The alternation of Yahweh imagery and Asherah imagery on these stands has been interpreted by several scholars, including William Dever, as visual confirmation of the pairing of Yahweh and Asherah that is documented in the Kuntilat Ajrud inscriptions, a pairing in which the two deities are worshipped together as a divine couple in early Israelite religion. The site of Kuntilat Ajrud itself, where some of the most important inscriptional evidence for Asherah's role in Israelite religion was found, deserves closer attention. Kuntilat Ajrud is a remote site in the Sinai Desert, roughly 50 kilometers south of Kadesh Barnea, that appears to have functioned as a way station or caravanserai, a stopping point on the trade route between Gaza and the Gulf of Aqaba. In the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, the site was excavated in the 1970s by Zeev Michel, and the finds were extraordinary. In addition to the inscriptions on the large pithoi, storage jars, that mention Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah, and Yahweh of Taman and his Asherah, the site produced plaster wall inscriptions with similar blessings, drawings on the pithoi that include depictions of humanoid figures and possibly divine imagery, and a collection of texts that include abecedaries, practice alphabets, religious blessings, and what may be hymnic or liturgical material. The diversity of this material and the remote location of the site suggests that it was a place where travelers from different parts of Israel and Judah stopped and left votive texts, a kind of pilgrimage or stopping point on the desert route. The fact that the inscriptions come from multiple hands and refer to Yahweh with different geographic designations, Yahweh of Samaria, Yahweh of Taman, suggests that the practice of invoking Yahweh alongside Asherah was widespread geographically, not confined to a single sect or region. The phrase Yahweh of Samaria and Yahweh of Taman in the Kuntilat Ajrud inscriptions is itself theologically significant. It suggests that Yahweh was understood in this period to have multiple local manifestations, different Yahwehs associated with different sacred places, in the same way that El had multiple local manifestations, El Bethel, El Shaddai, El Elyon, associated with different sacred sites across Canaan. This localization of deity, the understanding that the divine presence could be specifically and particularly present at a specific place in a way that made that manifestation somewhat distinct from other manifestations is a feature of ancient Near Eastern religion in general, and it is strongly at odds with the later monotheistic insistence on Yahweh's absolute unity and omnipresence. The Kuntalet Ajrid evidence suggests that even as late as the 9th century BCE, Yahweh had not yet been fully dispatched from the local, place-specific form of divine worship that characterized both the El tradition and the general Canaanite religious landscape. His gradual universalization, his transformation from the God of specific places and peoples into the omnipresent universal deity of all creation, was still very much in progress. Among the most important archaeological discoveries bearing on early Israelite religion are the remains of temples and cult installations from the period of the divided monarchy, the 9th and 8th centuries BCE. Several temples from this period have been excavated in Israel and Judah, and they provide direct evidence of the kind of religious practice that was conducted in Israelite sacred spaces. The temple at Arad in the Negev was an official Israelite royal temple built during the period of the monarchy. Its construction and operation were clearly state-sponsored, not the work of dissident sectarians. And it was a fully equipped Canaanite-style temple, complete with a main hall, an inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, a sacrificial altar, and, in the form in which it was excavated, 2 standing stones, Massaboth, and 2 small incense altars flanking the entrance to the inner sanctuary. The presence of 2 altars has been interpreted by some scholars as reflecting the worship of 2 deities, Yahweh and Asherah paired as a divine couple. The Massaboth, standing stones, are themselves significant. Standing stones are repeatedly condemned in the Deuteronomic law codes as prohibited cult objects, instruments of Canaanite religion to be destroyed. Yet here they are at an official state temple, suggesting that what later reformers condemned as Canaanite apostasy was actually, for an earlier period, standard Israelite religious practice. The temple at Tel Motza, discovered relatively recently, with significant findings published from 2012 onwards, is another important site. Located just west of Jerusalem, Tel Motza in the Iron Age Takuaye period, roughly the 10th century BCE, contained a large temple complex with cult statues of animals, horses, and what appear to be anthropomorphic figurines. The proximity of this temple to Jerusalem and its early date suggests that official Judahite religious practice in the early monarchic period included forms of cult image worship that the later tradition associated with idolatry. The horse figurines in particular are significant. The Book of 2 Kings describes Josiah's reform, removing from the Jerusalem temple the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun, suggesting that horse imagery had an official place in the Jerusalem cult, possibly related to solar worship, which is itself attested in the later Deuteronomistic condemnations of star worship in the Jerusalem temple. The high places, the Bamoth, that the Deuteronomistic history repeatedly condemns are another crucial element of early Israelite religious practice. These were outdoor or semi-outdoor sanctuaries, typically located on hilltops or prominent natural features where sacrifices and religious rituals were conducted. The Bible itself is not entirely negative about the high places in the early period. Samuel conducts religious rituals at the high place in his hometown. Elijah rebuilds the altar of Yahweh at the high place on Mount Carmel, and Solomon himself sacrifices at the high place at Gibeon, which the text describes as the great high place, and where God appears to Solomon in a dream. Only later, in the Deuteronomistic framework, does the existence of multiple local sanctuaries become a theological problem, because Deuteronomy insists that sacrifice must be offered only at the place where Yahweh your God will choose to put his name, a formula understood to refer exclusively to the Jerusalem temple. The centralization of worship at Jerusalem was a political and theological program of enormous consequence because it effectively delegitimized all other forms of Yahweh worship and all other sacred sites. But for most of the period of the monarchy, the high places were not apostasy. They were ordinary, widespread, arguably traditional Israelite religious practice. What the archaeological record, taken as a whole, suggests about early Israelite religion is something that biblical scholars have been arguing for decades. The official Yahwism of the Jerusalem temple and the prophetic tradition was not the only form of Israelite religion, and it was not necessarily the oldest or most widespread form. There was a rich, diverse, syncretic religious landscape in which Yahweh was worshipped alongside Asherah, in which divine images were used in official state temples, in which local sanctuaries served distinct local religious communities, and in which the boundary between Israelite religion and Canaanite religion was much more porous than the later biblical tradition admitted. The religion of the Bible, the strict Yahwism that eventually became the foundation of Judaism, was one tradition within this broader landscape, and it was a tradition that became dominant only gradually through a long process of prophetic advocacy, political pressure, and ultimately state-sponsored reform. Understanding this diversity of early Israelite religion is essential for understanding how the merger of El and Yahweh happened, because it was not a single event but a gradual process that unfolded differently in different communities and regions across the centuries of the monarchy. The figure of Moses stands at the beginning of this entire history, and the biblical narrative of the Exodus, whatever its historical relationship to actual events, preserves important information about how the Israelites understood the origin of their religion. The revelation to Moses at the burning bush is the foundational narrative of Israelite religion. It is the moment when the divine name is revealed, when the covenant with Israel is established, when the divine warrior Yahweh commits himself to the liberation of his people from Egypt. The theological importance of this narrative for the Israelites cannot be overstated. It is the narrative that gives Yahweh his defining characteristic as the God who saves, the God who acts in history on behalf of his people, the God whose power is demonstrated not in cosmic myth, but in historical event. The liberation from Egypt becomes the paradigmatic saving act of Yahweh, the event to which the prophets and poets of Israel return again and again as the supreme demonstration of divine power and divine commitment to Israel. The historical question of whether any form of the Exodus narrative has a historical basis is enormously complex and actively debated among scholars. There is no direct Egyptian evidence for a large-scale exodus of the kind described in the Bible. No Egyptian records of the plagues, no record of the drowning of Pharaoh's army, no record of several 100,000 Israelite slaves leaving Egypt simultaneously. The scale of the biblical narrative, 600,000 fighting men, which implies a total population of perhaps 2 to 3 million people, is almost universally regarded by scholars as an enormous exaggeration, almost certainly the result of centuries of legendary amplification of an original event of much smaller scale. But the complete absence of any historical basis for the Exodus has also been challenged. There is evidence of Semitic peoples living in Egypt during the New Kingdom period. There is evidence of forced labor on major building projects, and there is the Canaanite hypothesis that connects Moses specifically to the Midianite-Kenite tradition of southern desert worship. Some scholars, including most recently the Egyptologist James Hoffmeyer and the archaeologist William Dever, argue for a historical kernel behind the Exodus narrative. Perhaps a small group of Semitic people who experienced slavery in Egypt, escaped under dramatic circumstances, encountered a deity in the wilderness, and whose tradition was eventually adopted and vastly amplified by the emerging Israelite Confederation. Whether or not there was a historical Exodus, the tradition of the Exodus became the central historical self-understanding of Israel, and therefore the central context in which the merger of El and Yahweh played out. The revelation of the divine name at Sinai is the theological pivot of the entire biblical narrative. Before Sinai, Israel, or its ancestors, worshipped under the name El. After Sinai, Israel worships under the name Yahweh. The transition is explained theologically as a progressive revelation. The same God who had always existed and always governed the cosmos has now revealed his true, personal name to his chosen people. But historically, it marks the moment when the El worship of the Canaanite highlands was joined to the Yahweh worship of the southern desert. The moment when the patriarchal deity of the settled agricultural Canaanites was identified with the warrior deity of the desert nomads. This identification was not simply an intellectual or theological move. It was rooted in the specific social history of the people who became Israel. in the coalescence of different groups, highland Canaanites, desert nomads, possibly Egyptian refugees, into a new identity, and in the specific religious experiences and traditions that each group brought to that coalition. The God who emerged from this coalescence, the God of the Hebrew Bible, bore the marks of all these different origins. The ancient wisdom and cosmic authority of El, the fierce power and desert intensity of Yahweh, the storm imagery and warrior mythology of Baal, and the nurturing fertility associations of Asherah. He was, from the beginning, a composite figure, a synthesis of the divine world of Canaan and the desert south. El and Yahweh, the merger. The question of exactly how El and Yahweh were merged into a single deity is one of the most intricate and fascinating problems in the study of ancient Israelite religion. It was not a simple or instantaneous process. It happened gradually, across centuries, through multiple mechanisms and in multiple contexts. It was driven partly by theological reflection, partly by political pressures, partly by the natural tendency of syncretic religious traditions to absorb and integrate diverse divine figures, and partly by the specific circumstances of Israelite history. The formation of the monarchy, the centralization of worship in Jerusalem, the challenges of the Assyrian and Babylonian periods. To trace this merger, you have to look simultaneously at the textual evidence, the way the Bible's different literary layers handle the divine names and characteristics, and at the broader religious and historical context in which the synthesis was achieved. The most basic mechanism by which El and Yahweh were merged was the simple identification of names, the declaration, explicit or implicit, that El and Yahweh were the same deity, two names for one and the same God. This identification is itself explicitly stated in the Hebrew Bible. Genesis 14:22 has Abraham swear by Yahweh, El Elyon, combining the personal name of Israel's deity, Yahweh, with a title of the supreme Canaanite deity, El Elyon, Most High God. Psalm 68:4-5 juxtaposes the names Yahweh and El in immediate proximity. Sing to God, sing praises to his name, lift up a song to him who rides through the deserts. His name is Yahweh, exult before him. Father of the fatherless and protector of widows is God in his holy habitation. The Yahweh El identification is so thoroughly established in the final form of the biblical text that it reads as entirely natural and self-evident, but it represents the conclusion of a process that was once contested and complex. The textual evidence for the distinctness of El and Yahweh before their merger is most clearly visible in the way different passages of the Bible handle the divine names. The priestly source, P, and the Elohist source, E, both preserve the tradition that the name Yahweh was not known to the pre-Mosaic patriarchs, that they worshipped God under the name El Shaddai or Elohim. As we noted earlier, Exodus 6:2-3, a priestly passage, states this explicitly. God says to Moses that he appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but that his name Yahweh was not made known to them. This is a remarkable preservation of the memory that the pre-Mosaic tradition operated under a different divine name. In contrast, the Yahwist source, J, has God using the name Yahweh from the very beginning. In Genesis 2, the very first use of the name YHWH appears in the phrase Yahweh God, and this source shows no awareness of any distinction between the patriarchal deity and Yahweh. The Yahwist was apparently composing from a theological perspective in which the identification was already complete and taken for granted, while the priestly and Elohist sources preserved the older memory of a distinction. The fact that both perspectives were preserved in the final compiled text of the Pentateuch is a sign that the editors of the final text were working with source documents that preserved genuinely different traditions, and that they were not able or willing to entirely harmonize them. The process of El Yahweh identification was facilitated enormously by the transfer of El's titles and epithets to Yahweh. Once you begin to refer to Yahweh using the same titles that had been used for El, the identification becomes almost automatic, because the titles themselves carry the theological weight of the figure who bears them. The title, El Elyon, Most High God, appears in Psalm 91:1, which says, "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High, Elyon, will abide in the shadow of the Almighty, Shaddai. I will say to the Lord, Yahweh, my refuge and my fortress, my God, El in whom I trust." This single verse deploys 4 different divine names or titles: Elyon, Shaddai, Yahweh, El, and treats them all as referring to the same deity. This is the textual equivalent of the theological synthesis. By using all 4 names interchangeably in a single context, the text declares their essential identity and makes it impossible for a reader to maintain any sense of these as distinct divine figures. The same process is at work in Psalm 82, which opens with, God, Elohim, has taken his place in the divine assembly. In the midst of the gods, Elohim, he holds judgment. Here the chief god, described in terms drawn from El's role as divine judge and council president, holds judgment over the lesser gods who have failed to administer justice. The psalm ends with the remarkable declaration, I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High Elyon, all of you. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die. This passage preserves the memory of the polytheistic divine council, the sons of El, but dramatically subverts it by having the chief god announce that these lesser gods will die for their failure to exercise justice. The demotion of the divine council from eternal gods to mortal figures is one of the mechanisms by which the biblical tradition moved from the polytheism of the El tradition toward monotheism, but it is a mechanism that can only be understood against the background of the Canaanite divine family that the text is implicitly addressing. The transfer of El's mythology to Yahweh is visible in some of the most ancient poetry in the Bible. The creation theology of Psalm 104, for example, which describes God's creation of the world in imagery drawn directly from the Baal cycle tradition and in terms that have close parallels with Egyptian hymns to the sun, attributes to Yahweh the cosmic creative acts that in the Canaanite tradition belonged to El. El, as creator of created things, becomes Yahweh the creator. El's cosmic mountain becomes Yahweh's Zion. El's divine council becomes Yahweh's heavenly host. The machinery of divine authority was transferred wholesale from one name to another, and the theological meaning, the cosmic sovereignty, the paternal compassion, the juridical authority came along with it. One of the most revealing textual indicators of the El-Yahweh merger is the treatment of the divine name in the book of Genesis. Specifically, the patriarchal narratives of chapters 12 through 50, which scholars generally regard as containing some of the oldest material in the Pentateuch, even though the text, as we have it, was compiled and edited much later. In these narratives, God appears to the patriarchs under a variety of El names at specific sacred sites. God appears to Abraham as El Elyon at the sanctuary of Melchizedek in Jerusalem, Genesis 14, and establishes a covenant with him near the sacred oak at Mamre, Genesis 18. He appears to Isaac at Beersheba, Genesis 26:24. He appears to Jacob at Bethel, Genesis 28:10-22, at the Jabbok ford as El, Genesis 32, and again at Bethel, Genesis 35:1-15, explicitly calling himself El Shaddai. These local sanctuaries, Mamre, Beersheba, Bethel, Peniel, were all Canaanite sacred sites, places where El, or a local manifestation of El, had been worshipped long before the Israelites arrived. The patriarchal narratives present the founding fathers of Israel as receiving divine revelations at precisely these traditional sacred sites, and the divine name used in the revelations is consistently El, or an El compound. The Yahwist source occasionally substitutes Yahweh for El in its retelling of these same encounters, but the El names are preserved in the patriarchal narratives in a way that suggests they are original, that the original tradition said El appeared at Bethel, El appeared at Mamre, El Shaddai appeared to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and that only later did scribes, working within a theological framework in which El and Yahweh were the same, replace or supplement the El name with Yahweh. The sanctuary at Shiloh provides another important data point for understanding the El-Yahweh merger. Shiloh was the central sanctuary of the Israelite Confederation in the period before the monarchy, the place where the Ark of the Covenant was kept and where the annual pilgrimage festival was held. The divine name associated with Shiloh in the book of Samuel is a remarkable compound, Yahweh Sabaoth, usually translated the Lord of Hosts or Lord of Armies. The name Yahweh Sabaoth appears for the first time in the narrative in 1 Samuel 1:3, where it is used by the woman Hannah at Shiloh. Sabaoth is the Hebrew word for armies or hosts, military or divine hosts, and the name Yahweh Sabaoth thus means something like Yahweh of the armies or Yahweh of the divine hosts. This title is particularly interesting because it combines the personal name of Israel's desert deity, Yahweh, with a concept that belongs to the El tradition. El as the father and ruler of the divine host, the heavenly army of divine beings. The hosts in Yahweh Sabaoth include both Israel's earthly army and the heavenly divine beings, the angels, the stars understood as divine beings, the members of the divine council. By combining the name Yahweh with the concept of the divine host, El's divine family, the title Yahweh Sabaoth affects a synthesis that is both linguistic and theological. It is Yahweh who rules the divine council, Yahweh who commands both earthly and heavenly armies, Yahweh who occupies the position that El occupied in the Canaanite divine family. This title became one of the most important and frequently used divine names in the prophetic literature. Isaiah, Amos, Jeremiah, and Malachi all use it extensively, and it represents one of the key formulations through which the El Yahweh synthesis was articulated and disseminated. The role of the Jerusalem temple in the El Yahweh merger deserves special attention because the temple was the institutional center from which the official Yahwism of the monarchy was propagated, and its theological traditions were deeply influenced by both the El tradition and the Yahweh tradition. Jerusalem, the city that David captured from the Jebusites and made his capital, and where Solomon built the temple, was a Canaanite city with a pre-Israelite religious history. The Jebusites who inhabited it before David's conquest worshipped their own gods, and the traditions of those pre-Israelite gods did not simply vanish when the Israelites took over the city. They were absorbed into the Israelite tradition, contributing to the complex theological synthesis that characterizes Jerusalem's official religion. The figure of Melchizedek in Genesis 14, the Jebusite king-priest who blesses Abraham in the name of El Elyon, creator of heaven and earth, and who receives tithes from Abraham, suggests that the pre-Israelite Jebusite tradition associated with Jerusalem worshipped El Elyon as the chief deity. When David conquered Jerusalem and established his capital there, and when Solomon built the temple, the Jebusite tradition of El Elyon worship at Jerusalem was absorbed into the developing synthesis of Yahwism. The temple itself, with its architectural plan, the outer court, the inner hall, and the innermost sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, follows the same basic plan as Canaanite temples at Hazor and elsewhere, and its imagery, the cherubim, the sacred pillars, the bronze sea, the lampstand menorah, the incense altars, is drawn from the wider Canaanite religious tradition. The Zion theology that developed in connection with the Jerusalem temple is one of the most important products of the El Yahweh synthesis. Zion theology, the complex of ideas associated with Jerusalem as the mountain of God, the center of the cosmos, the dwelling place of the divine king, is drawn almost directly from the El tradition. El in the Ugaritic texts lives on a cosmic mountain at the source of the rivers. The Jerusalem temple is built on Mount Zion, described in the Psalms as the summit of Zaphon, and Zaphon was the name of Baal's mountain in the Ugaritic texts, the divine mountain of the Canaanite north. Psalm 48:2 says, Mount Zion in the far north is the city of the great king, using the Hebrew word Tsaphon, north, which in the Ugaritic tradition was the name of Baal's mountain, Mount Zaphon. This transfer of the sacred mountain symbolism from the northern divine mountain, Zaphon, where Baal dwelled, and the cosmic mountain, El's mountain at the source of the rivers, to Zion in Jerusalem, is one of the most dramatic examples of how the biblical tradition absorbed and relocated the geographical and theological symbolism of the Canaanite divine world into the specific sacred geography of Israel. The prophetic tradition that emerged from the Jerusalem temple complex was perhaps the most powerful force in driving the El Yahweh synthesis toward its final monotheistic form. The great classical prophets, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah of Jerusalem, Micah, Jeremiah, all worked within the tension between the complex religious world they observed around them and the rigorous theology of exclusive Yahwism that they championed. But even within the prophetic tradition, the El Yahweh synthesis is visible. Isaiah's vision of Yahweh enthroned in the temple, Isaiah 6, is structurally identical to El's enthronement in the divine council in the Ugaritic texts. The divine king sits on his throne, surrounded by divine beings, the seraphim, making cosmic decisions. The divine king in Isaiah's vision is Yahweh, but he is described in the language and imagery of El. When Isaiah refers to Yahweh as the Holy One of Israel, a title he uses more than 25 times, he is combining Yahweh's identity with the quality of holiness, El's transcendence, his raw divine power, in a way that draws on both traditions. When he refers to Yahweh as Father and describes the relationship between Yahweh and Israel in familial terms, he is drawing on the paternal character of El, the father of gods and men, and applying it to Yahweh. The synthesis was so thoroughly embedded in the prophetic tradition by the 8th century BCE that the prophets themselves may not always have been aware of the degree to which their theological language was a product of the preceding history of religious merger. The personal names that Israelites chose for their children provide another, more intimate window into the El-Yahweh synthesis. Before the monarchy, Israelite names containing theophoric elements, divine names, tend to use El. Names like Israel, Michael, Daniel, Uriel, Gabriel, Samuel, Shemuel, name of El, or El has heard, all use El as the divine element. During the monarchy, and increasingly as Yahwism became more dominant, names containing Yah or Yahu, abbreviated forms of Yahweh, become more common. Isaiah, Yeshayahu, Yahweh is salvation. Jeremiah, Yirmeyahu, Yahweh exalts. Hezekiah, Hizkiyahu, Yahweh is my strength. Joshua, Yehoshua, Yahweh is salvation. The shift in theophoric naming patterns from El to Yahweh over the course of the monarchy period is a quantifiable indicator of the shifting religious landscape, of the gradual displacement of El by Yahweh as the primary divine name in Israelite consciousness. But the El names never entirely disappeared. They remained throughout the biblical period and beyond, precisely because the El and Yahweh traditions had been identified as referring to the same deity. Perhaps the most philosophically important dimension of the El-Yahweh merger is the way it contributed to the development of the concept of divine transcendence, the idea that God is not simply one power among many, but the unique, utterly different ground of all existence. This concept, which is central to the later monotheism of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, was not present in the earliest Yahweh tradition, where Yahweh was a powerful but particular deity with specific geographic and national associations. It was present, in embryo, in the El tradition, in El's role as the creator of all created things, the father of all gods and all humanity, the source from which all divine authority derived. When Yahweh absorbed El's characteristics, he absorbed with them this tendency toward universalism and transcendence. And the prophetic tradition developed this tendency in the direction of full monotheism, the claim not merely that Yahweh was the most powerful God, or the God who had chosen Israel, but that Yahweh alone was God, that there were no other genuine divine beings, that the gods of the nations were nothing, idols, lies, vanity. This radical monotheistic claim, which becomes explicit in 2nd Isaiah 40:55, in the context of the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, was the culmination of a process that had begun centuries earlier in the merger of El and Yahweh and the gradual absorption of the divine world into a single divine center. The prophets and the war against polytheism. The prophets of ancient Israel are among the most remarkable figures in the history of human civilization, men and women who stood in their own time as the voice of moral and theological conscience, who challenged kings and priests and ordinary people alike to a standard of justice and exclusive religious devotion that their societies largely did not meet and sometimes did not want. The classical prophets, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Micah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, were not, in any simple sense, theological innovators. They understood themselves as speaking in the name of the God of Moses, calling Israel back to a covenant that had been made at Sinai and violated ever since. But, in the course of making that call, they articulated theological ideas of extraordinary power and originality. ideas about the nature of God, the demands of justice, the relationship between the divine and the human, that transformed the religious world of ancient Israel and laid the foundations for the monotheism that would reshape the entire Western world. To understand what the prophets were doing and why it mattered so profoundly, you have to understand the world they were fighting against, a world of rich religious diversity, of multiple divine figures competing for Israelite allegiance, of high places and divine images and Asherah poles and star worship and child sacrifice and all the other practices that the prophets condemned as apostasy. The earliest of the classical prophets to leave a written record is Amos, who was active in the northern kingdom of Israel in the mid-8th century BCE during the reign of Jeroboam II, around 760-750 BCE. Amos was a shepherd from the southern Judean town of Tekoa who was called to prophesy in the north, and his message was one of social and moral outrage. The wealthy classes of Israel were exploiting the poor, the courts were corrupt, the religious establishments were sanctimonious and morally hollow. Amos has often been characterized as the prophet of social justice, and with good reason. His denunciations of the rich who sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, and who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth, are among the most powerful expressions of prophetic moral outrage in all of biblical literature. But Amos was also, and fundamentally, a prophet of exclusive Yahwism. His social critique was inseparable from his theological conviction that Yahweh was the Lord of all nations, not merely of Israel, and that Yahweh's universal moral demands applied to Israelites and Gentiles alike. The opening chapters of the book of Amos condemn the surrounding nations, Syria, Philistia, Phoenicia, Edom, Ammon, Moab, Judah, for their crimes before turning on Israel itself. The logic of this universal condemnation is monotheistic in implication. Yahweh is not simply Israel's tribal deity, indifferent to what the other nations do. He is the moral sovereign of the entire world, and his justice applies everywhere. What makes Amos particularly significant for our story is what he implies about the religious world he is condemning. He attacks the high places of Isaac and the sanctuaries of Israel, suggesting a network of local sanctuaries spread across the northern kingdom, each with its own cult and its own local form of divine worship. He condemns the great pilgrimage festivals at Bethel and Gilgal, important ancient sanctuaries, not because the Israelites are worshiping foreign gods there, but because the worship at these sanctuaries has become empty ritual, disconnected from the moral demands of the covenant. He attacks the practice at Bethel of reclining on garments taken in pledge beside every altar, an apparent reference to a specific cultic practice, and the drinking of wine of those who have been fined in the house of their God. The picture that emerges from Amos's condemnations is not of a people who have abandoned Yahweh for Baal, but of a people who worship Yahweh and perhaps other divine figures at multiple local sanctuaries in ways that Amos regards as theologically and morally corrupt. The problem for Amos is not primarily that Israel worships false gods. It is that Israel worships Yahweh without justice, that the cult has become a substitute for ethical behavior rather than an expression of it. Hosea, Amos's near contemporary and also a prophet of the northern kingdom, takes the prophetic critique in a different and even more theologically interesting direction. Hosea's central metaphor for Israel's relationship with Yahweh is the marriage metaphor. Yahweh is Israel's husband, Israel is his wife, and Israel's worship of other gods is adultery, a betrayal of the marriage covenant, a prostitution of the sacred bond. The power of this metaphor, and Hosea is the first biblical writer to develop it fully, though it becomes one of the dominant metaphors of the later prophetic tradition, lies in its combination of emotional intensity with theological precision. By making the divine-human relationship a marriage, Hosea captures both the exclusivity of the relationship. Marriage is by definition exclusive in the ancient Near Eastern context, and its emotional depth. Yahweh's pain at Israel's apostasy is genuine, personal, and intense. The metaphor also makes Hosea's polemic against Baal worship particularly pointed. Israel goes after Baal in terms that echo the language of marital infidelity. and Yahweh threatens to strip her of her gifts, grain, wine, oil, wool, flax, before reclaiming her and renewing the relationship on more secure terms. What Hosea's polemic reveals is that the worship of Baal was intimately connected in the agricultural religion of northern Israel with the fertility of the land. The Israelites worshipped Baal, or credited Baal with the gifts of my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my drink. In other words, Baal worship was not merely a theological error, it was embedded in the practical agricultural religion of people who needed rain and fertility, and who naturally credited the rain deity with providing them. Hosea's prophetic strategy in response to this is one of the most sophisticated in the entire prophetic literature. Rather than simply condemning the Israelites for worshiping Baal, he insists that the gifts they think come from Baal actually come from Yahweh. She did not know, Hosea makes Yahweh say, that it was I who gave her the grain, the wine, and the oil, and who lavished on her silver and gold. Yahweh, not Baal, is the giver of agricultural fertility. Yahweh, not Baal, is the deity who brings the rain and makes the crops grow. By making this claim, by appropriating for Yahweh the agricultural functions that had traditionally been attributed to Baal, Hosea is engaged in precisely the theological maneuver we described earlier, absorbing Baal's functions and mythology into Yahweh's profile, while simultaneously delegitimizing Baal as a competitor. The theological significance of Hosea's position goes beyond mere prophetic polemic. He is articulating a theology in which Yahweh is not merely a political or tribal deity, but the source of all natural abundance, the one who controls not only the fortunes of nations, but the productivity of the earth itself. This universalization of Yahweh's domain, his extension over the agricultural and natural realm that had previously been Baal's territory, is a crucial step in the development toward full monotheism. Once Yahweh is credited with all the functions of all the other gods, once he is simultaneously the cosmic father, El, the stormbringer and fertility god, Baal, the divine warrior, Anat's characteristics, and the sovereign of all nations, Yahweh's own original characteristic, there is simply no function left for any other god to perform, and the elimination of all other divine figures becomes not just a political preference, but a theological necessity. The logic of monotheism is already implicit in Hosea's prophetic program. It would take another 2 centuries to become explicit. Isaiah of Jerusalem, active in the southern kingdom during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, roughly 740–700 BCE, represents another dimension of the prophetic engagement with the El-Yahweh synthesis. Isaiah's theology is more explicitly centered on Zion, the mountain of God in Jerusalem, than the northern prophets, and his vision of Yahweh in chapter 6 is one of the most theologically dense texts in the entire Hebrew Bible. The vision opens with Isaiah seeing Yahweh sitting on a throne, high and exalted, and the train of his robe filled the temple. The seraphim, divine beings with 6 wings, surround the throne, calling out in alternation, "Holy, holy, holy is Yahweh Sabaoth, the whole earth is full of his glory." The structure of this vision is entirely consistent with the divine council tradition derived from El, the supreme deity enthroned in his heavenly palace, surrounded by divine beings who serve and worship him. The title, Yahweh Sabaoth, Lord of Hosts, the title we discussed earlier as a synthesis of Yahweh's name with El's divine counsel, is the title used in this foundational moment. And the declaration that the whole earth is full of his glory is a statement of universal divine sovereignty. Yahweh's domain is not limited to Israel or to the Jerusalem temple, but encompasses the entire world. This is the El-Yahweh synthesis expressed in the most elevated religious poetry. A deity who sits enthroned in his cosmic palace, as in the El tradition, but whose name is Yahweh and whose sovereignty is explicitly universal. Isaiah's response to the political crises of his time, particularly the Assyrian threat to Judah under Sennacherib, which culminated in the famous siege of Jerusalem in 701 BCE, also reflects the deepening El-Yahweh synthesis. When Assyria threatens Jerusalem and the Assyrian ambassador stands before the walls of the city and taunts the Israelites with the argument that no God has been able to save any nation from Assyria's power, the question being raised is precisely the question of Yahweh's universality. Is Yahweh just another local deity, like the gods of Hamath and Arpad and Samaria, who are powerless against Assyrian might? Isaiah's response, that Yahweh will defend Jerusalem and destroy the Assyrian army, is delivered with the absolute confidence of one who believes that Yahweh is not a local deity, but the sovereign of all nations, who uses Assyria as his instrument and will discard it when it has served its purpose. The narrative of the miraculous deliverance of Jerusalem from the Assyrian siege, whether the mechanism was a plague, a diplomatic settlement, or some other factor, became one of the most theologically powerful events in Judahite history, a confirmation of Zion theology and of Yahweh's universal sovereignty that would reverberate for centuries. Micah, Isaiah's contemporary, adds another dimension to the prophetic portrait, the explicit universalism that would become one of the most enduring contributions of the classical prophets to the Western religious imagination. It is Micah, or possibly a later editor of the Isaiah scroll working in Micah's tradition, who first articulates the vision of all nations streaming to the mountain of Yahweh, beating their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, learning war no more. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of Yahweh from Jerusalem. A vision of universal divine sovereignty exercised not through military conquest, but through the universal acceptance of Yahweh's teaching. This vision is monotheistic, not just in the sense that there is one God, but in the sense that this one God's sovereignty is genuinely universal, that his claim on human beings is not tribal or national, but encompasses all of humanity. The cosmic patriarch of El's tradition, the father of gods and men, has here been transformed into the universal divine sovereign whose just law will govern all peoples, a transformation that is only possible because El's universal paternity has been identified with and absorbed into Yahweh's particular covenant relationship with Israel. Jeremiah, who prophesied in Jerusalem from the late 7th century through the beginning of the Babylonian exile in the early 6th century, represents the prophetic tradition at its most intense and anguished moment. Jeremiah lived through the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Babylonians in 587–586 BCE, the most catastrophic event in the history of the Israelite monarchy, and the event that would prove to be the crucible in which Israelite religion was definitively transformed into Judaism. But in the period before the destruction, Jeremiah's prophetic work gives us a remarkably clear picture of the religious landscape of Judah in the late 7th century BCE, and that landscape is one in which the religious diversity we have been describing was still very much alive. Jeremiah condemns the burning of incense to Baal in the high places of Topheth in the valley of Hinnom. He condemns the worship of the Queen of Heaven, almost certainly Asherah or a related goddess, by the women of Jerusalem who bake cakes in her image and pour out drink offerings. He condemns the worship of all the host of heaven, the sun, moon, and stars understood as divine beings, which had apparently been conducted on the rooftops of Jerusalem. He condemns the Tophet cult in the valley of Hinnom, where children were apparently passed through fire or sacrificed to Molech. He condemns the use of images and idols in the worship of Yahweh. The cumulative picture is of a religious landscape in which Yahwism existed alongside a rich array of other divine figures and practices, in which the temple itself had served as the site of multiple forms of worship, and in which the reform program of Josiah, which had tried to eliminate all these alternative forms, had not succeeded in establishing exclusive Yahwism as the practice of the Judahite population. The reform of Josiah, 640–609 BCE, is the single most important political event in the history of Israelite religion before the Babylonian exile, and its relationship to the El-Yahweh synthesis is complex and crucial. Josiah's reform, described in 2 Kings 22–23 and in the Deuteronomistic history that contextualizes it, was triggered by the discovery of the Book of the Law in the temple during repair work, a book that scholars almost universally identify with some form of the Book of Deuteronomy or its core. On the basis of this book, Josiah undertook a radical program of religious purification. He He destroyed the high places throughout Judah and even extended his reach into the former northern kingdom of Israel. He removed from the temple all the vessels made for Baal and Asherah. He deposed the priests of the high places. He destroyed the Asherah poles. He desecrated the Tophet in the valley of Hinnom. He removed the horses dedicated to the sun from the temple entrance. He destroyed the altars that the kings of Judah had built on the temple roof. He brought down the high places of Solomon that had been built for Chemosh, the god of Moab, Milcom, the god of Ammon, and Asherah, and he centralized all sacrificial worship at the Jerusalem temple, declaring all other places of sacrifice illegitimate. The Josianic reform was, in essence, an attempt to realize in political and institutional reality the theological program that the classical prophets had been articulating for more than a century: the exclusive worship of Yahweh, the elimination of all other divine figures from the official cult, the centralization of worship at a single controlled sanctuary in Jerusalem, and the enforcement of the Deuteronomic law code as the standard of Israelite religious life. The fact that such a sweeping reform was necessary, that the king had to physically destroy temples and altars and cult objects across the entire country, is itself powerful evidence of how diverse and widespread the non-Yahwistic elements of Israelite religion were. You do not need a national reform campaign to eliminate marginal or fringe practices. The scale and violence of Josiah's reform implies that what he was eliminating was mainstream. The worship of Asherah in the temple, the high places of Baal, the star worship, the female figurines, the Tophet cult, these were not the practices of a deviant minority. They were the practices of a substantial portion of the Judahite population, including apparently the official establishment of the temple itself. The Deuteronomic law code that drove Josiah's reform, and which became the foundation of what scholars call Deuteronomistic theology, the theological framework of the historical books of Joshua through Kings, contains the most explicit and programmatic statement of exclusive Yahwism in the entire Bible, the Shema, the foundational declaration of Jewish faith. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one, Deuteronomy 6:4. is a statement that can be read in multiple ways, but that in its Deuteronomic context functions as a declaration of exclusive loyalty. Yahweh alone is your God. There is only one Yahweh, as opposed to local manifestations of different divine figures, and your devotion must be exclusive and total. The commandment that follows immediately, you shall love Yahweh your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might, extends this declaration into a demand for the complete orientation of the entire person toward the one God. This is not yet the full philosophical monotheism of 2nd Isaiah. It is still primarily a demand for exclusive loyalty rather than a metaphysical claim about the non-existence of other divine beings. But it is a crucial step on the path toward that monotheism, and it provides the theological framework within which the Deuteronomistic historians interpreted the entire history of Israel from the conquest to the exile. The Deuteronomistic historians, the editors who compiled and shaped the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, use this theological framework to interpret the entire arc of Israelite history as a story of covenant faithfulness and covenant betrayal, of divine blessing and divine punishment. Every king of the northern kingdom is judged by the single criterion of whether he walked in the way of Jeroboam son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin, a reference to Jeroboam's golden calves. Every king of Judah is judged by the criterion of whether he maintained the exclusive worship of Yahweh in Jerusalem or allowed or encouraged worship at the high places. Good kings, Hezekiah and Josiah, are praised for reforming the cult and eliminating the high places. Bad kings, Manasseh above all, are condemned for introducing or allowing Baal worship, Asherah poles, star worship, and child sacrifice. The Deuteronomistic framework thus retrospectively imposed the monotheistic standard of the reform movement onto the entire history of the monarchy, creating a narrative in which the correct religion, exclusive Yahwism centered on Jerusalem, had always been the standard, and the actual religious diversity of the period was always apostasy and sin. This retrospective narrative shaped how subsequent generations of Jews understood their religious history, and it is the primary reason why so many people today assume that strict monotheism was Israel's religion from the beginning. when in fact it was the achievement of a long and contested historical process. The conflict between the prophets and the religious establishment they challenged was also, in many ways, a conflict about social structure and political power. The high places and local sanctuaries that the Reform condemned were not just theological errors. They were centers of local authority, places where local communities maintained their own religious identity independent of the central establishment in Jerusalem. To eliminate the high places was to centralize not only religious practice, but also the economic and political power that came with the control of sacrifice and tithing. The Jerusalem temple under the monarchy was simultaneously a theological center and an economic institution, a place where tithes were collected, where the agricultural surplus of the kingdom was organized and redistributed, where the political legitimacy of the Davidic dynasty was maintained through the divine sanction provided by the Ark of the Covenant and the priestly rituals. Josiah's reform strengthened all of these centralizing tendencies simultaneously. It eliminated competitors to the Jerusalem cult, increased the temple's economic base by requiring all sacrifice to be conducted there, and legitimized the Davidic political order by presenting exclusive Yahwism as the authentic covenant religion of Israel. The theological and the political were inseparable. The figure of the prophet in ancient Israel was itself a product of the tension between these different religious and political forces. The prophets were not simply religious reformers in the modern sense. They were, in the ancient world, a specific kind of religious specialist associated with the tradition of spirit possession, ecstatic experience, and direct divine communication that was common throughout the ancient Near East. The Canaanite tradition had its own prophets. The prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah who appear in the Elijah narratives are not described in a way that suggests they are entirely unlike the Israelite prophets. They are in the same business of claiming divine communication, of serving as intermediaries between the divine and human worlds. What distinguished the classical Israelite prophets was the specific content of their message. The insistence on exclusive Yahwism, social justice, and the priority of ethical behavior over ritual performance, and the tradition of written prophecy that preserved their words for future generations. But their social role and their claim to divine authority were not unique to Israel. They were part of the broader ancient Near Eastern landscape of divine communication and religious specialization. By the end of the 7th century BCE, the prophetic tradition had produced a theological revolution that, while not yet complete, had fundamentally altered the religious landscape of Judah. The diversity of religious practice that had characterized the earlier period of the monarchy was not eliminated. As Jeremiah's evidence clearly shows, it continued right up to and beyond the Babylonian destruction, but it had been delegitimized, condemned, and subjected to the first serious state-sponsored suppression in Israelite history. The stage was set for the great theological transformation that would be completed in the crucible of the Babylonian exile. The transformation from monolatry to full philosophical monotheism, from the exclusive worship of one God among many to the metaphysical claim that there is only one God in all reality. That transformation was the work of 2nd Isaiah and the exile generation, and it is the next chapter in our story. The Babylonian exile, monotheism is born. In 587 BCE, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II destroyed the city of Jerusalem. He burned the temple to the ground. He dismantled the city walls. He deported the bulk of the Judahite elite, the priests, the scribes, the skilled craftsmen, the political leaders, to Babylon, leaving behind only the poorest and least threatening elements of the population. The kingdom of Judah was over. The Davidic dynasty was in captivity. The temple, the physical center of Yahweh's presence on earth, was rubble. The Ark of the Covenant, if it had survived the earlier Babylonian incursion of 597 BCE, was gone, its fate unknown, never mentioned again in the historical record. This catastrophe, which the biblical tradition calls the exile, was not merely a political and military disaster. It was a theological crisis of the first order, a challenge to every aspect of the existing theological framework that the prophets and the Deuteronomistic tradition had developed over the preceding century. The crisis was framed from the perspective of the Deuteronomistic theology in terms of divine punishment. Yahweh had allowed Jerusalem to be destroyed because Israel had violated the covenant, had worshipped other gods, had failed to keep the law of Moses, had rejected the warnings of the prophets. This interpretation, developed by Jeremiah and Ezekiel among others, allowed the exile to be understood not as a refutation of Yahweh's power, but as a demonstration of it. Yahweh was powerful enough to use Babylon as his instrument of judgment against his own people, just as he had used Assyria earlier. But this interpretation, while preserving Yahweh's sovereignty, also raised a profound and troubling question. If Yahweh had allowed his temple to be destroyed and his people to be exiled, what did this mean for the nature of the divine-human relationship? Could Yahweh still be worshipped without the temple? Could sacrifices be offered without the altar? Could the covenant survive without the land? These were not merely practical questions. They were questions about the nature of God himself, about whether a deity so intimately associated with a specific place and people could transcend the loss of both. The answer that emerged from the crucible of the exile was the most theologically radical step in the entire history of Israelite religion, the step to full, explicit, philosophical monotheism. And the person who articulated this step most powerfully and influentially was the unknown prophet known to scholars as 2nd Isaiah, the author of the second major section of the book of Isaiah, chapters 40 and 55, writing in Babylon in the middle of the 6th century BCE, probably around 550-540 BCE, in the period just before Cyrus the Great of Persia began his conquests that would eventually result in the release of the Jewish exiles. 2nd Isaiah is, by universal scholarly consensus, one of the greatest theological and literary minds in the history of humanity. His writing is of extraordinary beauty and power. The famous servant songs, the "Comfort, Comfort My People" opening, the declarations of divine sovereignty, the vision of a new exodus from Babylon, and his theological contribution was revolutionary. He was the first person in the history of the world to articulate clearly and unambiguously the claim that there is only one God in all of reality and that all other supposed gods are nothing, not lesser gods, not subordinate gods, not rival gods, but nothing, non-entities, human fabrications with no existence and no power whatsoever. The most explicit statements of this monotheism in 2nd Isaiah are found in passages like Isaiah 44:6-8. Thus says Yahweh, the King of Israel and his Redeemer, Yahweh Sabaoth. I am the first and I am the last. Besides me there is no God. Who is like me? Let him proclaim it. Let him declare and set it before me, since I appointed an ancient people. Let them declare what is to come and what will happen. Fear not, nor be afraid. Have I not told you from of old and declared it? And you are my witnesses. Is there a God besides me? There is no rock, I know not any. And again in 45:5-7. I am Yahweh, and there is no other. Besides me there is no God. I equip you, though you do not know me, that people may know, from the rising of the sun and from the west, that there is none besides me. I am Yahweh, and there is no other. I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am Yahweh, who does all these things. These are statements of absolute metaphysical monotheism, not merely the preference for one God over others, not merely the exclusive worship of one deity among many who might exist, but the claim that there is literally no other divine reality anywhere in the cosmos. Yahweh alone is God. The other gods are nothing. The famous idol polemic of 2nd Isaiah, the extended satirical passages in which the prophet mocks the makers of idols who use half a log to cook food and the other half to make a god, serves this same monotheistic agenda. The target of the polemic is not simply idolatry in the sense of worshipping images rather than the imageless Yahweh. The target is the very idea that there are other gods at all. If the gods of Babylon, Bel, Nebo, Marduk, are nothing but human constructions, then the entire religious world of the ancient Near East, with its rich pantheons and its complex divine families, collapses into meaninglessness. Only Yahweh remains, and Yahweh, as 2nd Isaiah presents him, is not merely the God of Israel, but the creator of the entire cosmos, the Lord of all history, the one who calls Cyrus of Persia my shepherd and my anointed, in Hebrew, my Messiah, to accomplish the divine purpose of restoring Israel to its land. the universalism of 2nd Isaiah's theology, in which even the Persian king serves Yahweh's purposes, in which Yahweh is explicitly said to be the God of all the nations, even if they do not know him, is the fullest expression of the trajectory that began with El's cosmic paternity and that was carried forward through the prophetic tradition. El, as father of gods and men, becomes Yahweh as sole creator and sovereign of all reality. The specific theological problem that 2nd Isaiah's monotheism was addressing was the challenge posed by the Babylonian religious environment. The Babylonians were not simply military conquerors, they were the inheritors of the greatest religious and cultural tradition of the ancient world. Their chief deity Marduk, who had absorbed the characteristics of several earlier Mesopotamian divine figures, just as Yahweh had absorbed El's and Baal's characteristics, was celebrated in the great Enuma Elish creation epic as the conqueror of chaos, the maker of the cosmos, the sovereign of gods and men. The annual New Year festival in Babylon, the Akatu festival, was one of the great religious celebrations of the ancient world, a 12-day ceremony in which the Enuma Elish was recited. The statue of Marduk was carried in procession through the city, and the king was ritually humiliated and then reaffirmed as Marduk's representative on earth. The Jewish exiles in Babylon were surrounded by this religion, forced to observe its claims and its pageantry, and confronted daily with the argument that the victory of Babylon over Jerusalem meant the victory of Marduk over Yahweh. 2nd Isaiah's polemic against Babylonian idolatry is precisely a response to this challenge. The Babylonian gods are nothing. Their statues are blocks of wood and metal that have to be carried by their worshippers, while Yahweh carries his people. Bel bows down, Nebo stoops. Their idols are on beasts and on livestock. These things you carry are borne as burdens on weary beasts. They stoop, they bow down together. They cannot save the burden, but themselves go into captivity. Isaiah 46:1-2. The contrast 2nd Isaiah draws between the carried idol and the carrying God encapsulates the theological revolution of the exile. The gods of Babylon must be transported by their worshippers, dependent on human agency, subject to the accidents of war and conquest, capable of being captured and carried off. Yahweh, by contrast, carries his people. He is the one who acts, who sustains, who lifts up and bears. This contrast expresses the fundamental difference between the idol theology of the ancient Near East and the emerging monotheism of the exilic tradition, not merely the rejection of images, but the rejection of the entire framework of divinity as a local, particular, physically present power that can be located, captured, and controlled. Yahweh cannot be controlled because he is not one power among many, but the ground of all power, the source from which all existence derives. This is the El tradition's cosmic paternity, the creator of all created things, taken to its logical conclusion. If Yahweh is the creator of all created things, then there is simply nothing outside him that could limit or challenge or equal him. The contribution of the priestly tradition to the exile's theological revolution is equally important, though less dramatic. The priestly writers, the authors of Leviticus, Numbers, and the priestly sections of Genesis and Exodus, were working in the same period as 2nd Isaiah, probably writing in Babylon and addressing the same crisis of exile. But their response was different in character. Rather than the soaring prophetic poetry of 2nd Isaiah, the priestly writers produced an elaborately structured theological system, a comprehensive account of the divine ordering of the cosmos, the establishment of the covenant, the institution of the sacrificial cult, and the principles of holiness that governed the relationship between Yahweh and his people. The priestly creation account in Genesis 1:1-2-4a is the most theologically sophisticated creation narrative in the entire ancient Near East. Unlike the Babylonian Enuma Elish, in which the cosmos is created through divine warfare, Marduk dismembering the body of the slain chaos dragon Tiamat, the priestly creation account presents creation as an entirely peaceful act of divine speech. God speaks, and the world comes into existence. The cosmic chaos, tohu wavohu, formless void, is not a divine enemy to be defeated. It is simply the state of raw existence before God's creative word brings order and form. God does not fight to create the world. He speaks it into being. This is a radical theological statement. A God who creates by speech alone, who needs no material to work with and no enemies to overcome, is a God whose power is not one force among many forces in the cosmos, but the source of all force, all order, all existence. It is the fullest possible expression of El's status as creator of created things, now attributed definitively and exclusively to Yahweh. The priestly account of creation is also remarkable for its treatment of the divine council. In the El tradition and in the older polytheistic context, the cosmos was populated by divine beings, the sons of El, the heavenly host, the divine council, who participated in the governance of the world and who had independent existence and independent wills. The priestly creation account systematically demythologizes this divine council. The sun and moon, which throughout the ancient Near East were understood as divine beings, worshipped as gods, are described in Genesis 1 simply as the greater light and the lesser light, without names, without divine status, without any characteristics except their function of providing light and marking the seasons. They are not gods, they are lamps. The stars, the host of heaven, worshipped in the Jerusalem temple, mentioned in the Deuteronomic condemnations of star worship, are mentioned at the end of verse 16 as an afterthought. And he made the stars also. The stars are not divine beings, they are decorations. This systematic elimination of divine status from the elements of the natural world, sun, moon, stars, waters, land, is one of the most important acts of theological demythologization in the history of religion. It removes from the cosmos all the divine presences that had populated it in the ancient Near Eastern religious imagination, leaving only one divine presence, the Creator God, who stands above and outside the creation, who made it and governs it, but is not identical with any part of it. The concept of the Sabbath, as developed in the priestly creation account, serves a similar theological function. By building the 7-day week into the structure of creation itself, by having God rest on the seventh day and thereby consecrate it as holy, the priestly writers provided the exilic community with a form of religious observance that required no temple, no altar, no sacrifice, no priesthood, and no land. The Sabbath could be observed anywhere, in Babylon, in Egypt, in any land of exile, because it was inscribed in the very structure of time, not in any particular geographic place. This was an enormous theological innovation, one of the most practically significant in the entire history of religion. By creating a portable religious observance tied to time rather than space, the priestly tradition gave the Jewish community a way to maintain its religious identity and its covenant relationship with Yahweh, even in the absence of the temple and the land. The Sabbath, circumcision, another priestly covenant sign that requires no temple, and the dietary laws, elaborated in the priestly code, became the three great portable marks of Jewish identity that sustained the community through the exile and beyond. The exile also produced, in a more indirect way, a new understanding of the nature of divine revelation. Before the exile, Yahweh's presence and will had been mediated primarily through the temple cult and the priestly rituals conducted there. When the temple was destroyed, this channel of divine communication was cut off, and the community had to find alternative forms of divine communication. The prophetic tradition provided one alternative: the prophet as the bearer of the divine word, the one who speaks directly in Yahweh's name. The growing corpus of written scripture provided another: the written law, Torah, as the permanent portable record of the divine will, accessible to communities everywhere without requiring a physical cult site. The exile period saw an enormous intensification of the activity of textual compilation, editing, and interpretation, the writing and editing of the Deuteronomistic history, the compilation of the prophetic books, the composition of the priestly material, the gathering of psalms and wisdom literature. This explosion of literary activity was itself a theological response to the exile. If God's presence could not be accessed through temple worship, it could be accessed through the careful study and interpretation of the written record of divine revelation. The concept of the book, Torah, Scripture, as a vehicle of divine presence became during the exile, one of the central organizing principles of the Jewish religious identity. This is the beginning of what scholars call the religion of the book, and it is one of the most important long-term consequences of the exile for Western religious history. The figure of Ezekiel, the priest-prophet, who was himself among the first wave of exiles taken to Babylon in 597 BCE, bridges the prophetic and priestly traditions in a way that is uniquely illuminating for understanding the exile's theological revolution. Ezekiel's book opens with an extraordinary vision of the divine presence, the famous chariot vision, Merkava, in which Yahweh appears riding on a cosmic vehicle drawn by 4 living creatures, each with 4 faces: human, lion, ox, eagle, surrounded by wheels within wheels and fire and rainbow light. This vision, which is one of the most theologically complex and visually strange passages in the entire Bible, serves a specific theological purpose. It portrays the divine presence, the kavod, the glory, as portable and mobile, not fixed in the Jerusalem temple. The same glory that had filled the temple at its dedication, 1 Kings 8, now appears in Babylon, in the land of exile, above the river Chebar. Yahweh's presence is not limited to Jerusalem. It can travel wherever his people are, because it is not a territorial power, but a universal one. The chariot vision is thus a theological response to the exile that is entirely consistent with the second Isaiah's universalism and the priestly account's removal of the divine from the local and particular. Yahweh cannot be contained in any one place, because he is the God of all places. Ezekiel's vision of the restored temple at the end of his book, the elaborate architectural description in chapters 40-48 of a rebuilt, purified temple in which the divine glory returns and takes up permanent residence, represents the other side of the theological response to the exile. Not the acceptance of God's absence from the temple, but the hope of a future perfect restoration in which the temple will be rebuilt and the divine presence will return. This hope, for a rebuilt temple, for a restored Davidic king, for a renewed covenant, for the return of the scattered people to the land, was the eschatological dimension of exile theology, the vision of a future that would be better than anything the past had contained. This eschatological hope, developed in Ezekiel and 2nd Isaiah and in the later prophetic texts of the post-exilic period, became one of the most powerful and enduring features of the Jewish religious imagination, and eventually, through Judaism's children Christianity and Islam, of the Western world's religious imagination as a whole. By the time the exiles began to return to Judah after the decree of Cyrus in 538 BCE, the religious world they carried with them was fundamentally different from the world that had existed before the exile. The rich diversity of Israelite religion, the multiple divine figures, the local sanctuaries, the female figurines, the Asherah poles, the high places, the star worship, had been subjected to a century of prophetic condemnation, a sweeping state-sponsored reform under Josiah, and then the shattering of the entire institutional framework of temple and monarchy. What emerged from the exile was not a religion that had been restored to some imagined pristine original state, but a religion that had been remade in the crucible of catastrophe, leaner, more theologically rigorous, more focused on text and law, more explicitly monotheistic, and committed to a form of exclusive Yahwism that would gradually become the dominant and eventually the only legitimate form of Jewish religious practice. El had become Yahweh. Yahweh had become the only God. The transformation was complete, or nearly so. There were still loose ends, still survivals of the older world, still negotiations to be made. And those negotiations form the next chapter of our story, the post-exilic world, reconstructing God. The return from Babylon was nothing like the triumphant new Exodus that 2nd Isaiah had prophesied. The Persian king Cyrus issued his famous decree in 538 BCE permitting the Jewish exiles to return to their land and rebuild their temple, and some did return. But the reality of post-exilic Judah, now called Yehud by its Persian administrators, was considerably more modest and more complicated than the great prophetic visions of restoration had suggested. The first returnees found a land not empty but occupied by people who had remained in Judah through the exile, by Edomites and Samaritans and other neighboring peoples who had moved into the abandoned areas, and by the descendants of those Judahites who had never been deported. They also found a land and economic and agricultural ruin, the infrastructure of the kingdom destroyed and not yet rebuilt. The rebuilding of the temple, which eventually produced what scholars call the Second Temple, completed around 515 BCE, was a fraught process, marked by conflict between the returnees and the existing population, between the different priestly and Levitical factions competing for control of the restored cult, and between different visions of what post-exilic Judaism should look like. The religious world of post-exilic Judah was not the perfectly monotheistic community that the exile theology had envisioned. The people who had remained in the land had continued their own forms of religious practice during the exile period, practices that the returnees, steeped in the rigorous monotheism of the exile community, regarded as compromised and impure. The conflict between the pure returnees and the contaminated residents is dramatized in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which describe the bitter struggle over intermarriage, the prohibition on marrying non-Israelite women who might bring their gods and practices with them into the Israelite community. Ezra's dramatic public dissolution of mixed marriages, in which Jewish men were required to send away their foreign wives and the children born of those marriages, is one of the most startling episodes in the entire Bible. A moment at which the concern for religious purity overrode the claims of family and personal loyalty. The theological rationale was the same one that had been articulated in the Deuteronomic Law Code. Intermarriage leads to the worship of foreign gods, which violates the covenant, which brings divine punishment. The lesson of the exile, that religious impurity leads to national catastrophe, was so deeply embedded in the consciousness of the returnees that they were willing to take extreme measures to prevent its recurrence. The construction and operation of the Second Temple provided the institutional framework within which the post-exilic religious community organized itself. The temple was smaller and less magnificent than Solomon's temple. The older priests who had seen the first temple reportedly wept when they saw the new one, because the contrast was so painful. But what the Second Temple lacked in grandeur, it compensated for in theological significance. It was the place where the post-exilic community attempted to realize, in institutional form, the monotheistic theology that had been developed in the exile. The elaborate sacrificial system of the priestly tradition, with its daily offerings, its weekly Sabbath offerings, its monthly new moon offerings, its annual cycle of festivals, its elaborate system of purity and atonement, was implemented with a rigor and systematic completeness that the pre-exilic temple had apparently not possessed. The high priest, rather than the king, there was no longer a Davidic king on the throne, only a Persian governor, became the central religious and eventually political figure in the community. The Levitical and priestly hierarchies, working from the priestly law codes, managed the temple cult with meticulous attention to every detail of ritual law. And alongside the temple, the institution of the synagogue, or something like it, a gathering place for communal prayer and Torah reading, began to develop as a supplement to the temple cult, ensuring that religious life was not limited to those who could physically attend the temple in Jerusalem. The most important theological work of the post-exilic period was the compilation and editing of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses that would become the foundation of all subsequent Jewish religious life. The process of Torah compilation had been going on for centuries, as we have seen. The different documentary sources, JEDP, had been composed at various periods from the 9th century BCE onward, but the actual work of bringing these sources together into a single text was largely accomplished in the post-exilic period. The figure of Ezra, described in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah as a scribe skilled in the law of Moses, is associated in the tradition with the public reading of the Torah to the assembled community and with its establishment as the authoritative foundation of Jewish religious life. Whether or not the historical Ezra did exactly what the texts say he did, the general picture they convey of the Torah being publicly promulgated and accepted as the supreme authority for the Jewish community in the late 5th century BCE represents a crucial moment in the development of what would become Judaism. The Torah-centered community, organized around the study and interpretation of the written word of God, was the form of religious life that survived the loss of the temple in 70 CE and eventually produced both rabbinic Judaism and, through its interactions with Hellenistic culture, early Christianity. But the post-exilic period also saw the emergence of new theological questions that had not been fully addressed in the exile theology. The most pressing of these was the problem of evil, specifically the problem of why, if Yahweh was the sole creator and sovereign of the cosmos, the world contained so much suffering, injustice, and apparent disorder. In the older polytheistic framework, evil and suffering could be explained relatively easily. The world was governed by multiple divine powers that were sometimes in conflict, and human suffering resulted from being caught in the crossfire of divine disputes or from the malevolent activity of hostile divine forces. But in a strict monotheism, where Yahweh is the creator of everything including darkness and calamity, as 2 Isaiah explicitly stated, I form light and create darkness, I make well-being and create calamity, I am Yahweh who does all these things. The problem of evil becomes a problem about the nature of God himself. Why does an omnipotent, omniscient, and supposedly just God allow the innocent to suffer? The book of Job, probably composed in the post-exilic period, though its date is disputed, is the most sustained and powerful engagement with this question in the entire Hebrew Bible. The theological world of Job is, strikingly, not a strictly monotheistic world in the philosophical sense. The book opens with a divine council scene in which the sons of God present themselves before Yahweh, and one of them, the Ha-Satan, the adversary, or the accuser, a member of the divine council who functions as a kind of heavenly prosecutor, proposes the test of Job's faithfulness that drives the narrative. The Satan in Job is not the cosmic embodiment of evil that he becomes in later Jewish and Christian theology. He is a member of Yahweh's court, doing a specific juridical function, but his presence in the narrative, as a divine being with genuine independent agency who can propose and carry out a plan that results in enormous human suffering, is a sign that even the post-exilic biblical tradition had not entirely eliminated the divine council and its members. The sons of God, the adversary, the divine court, these figures from the El tradition survived in the literary imagination of even the most rigorously monotheistic period of biblical composition. The book of Job also engages with the theological inheritance of El in a more subtle way. Job's relationship with God in the book is characterized by a combination of intimacy and terror that matches precisely the relationship between human heroes and El in the Ugaritic tradition, the personal paternal deity who can be appealed to, who responds to human need, but whose ultimate decisions are mysterious and whose power is overwhelming. Job's protests against divine injustice, his demand that God appear and answer his case directly, his insistence on the personal character of his relationship with God. I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. All of this reflects the El tradition of the compassionate, approachable divine Father who can be held to account because he has entered into a personal relationship with human beings. And God's answer to Job from the whirlwind, the famous speeches in which Yahweh responds not with answers to Job's theological questions, but with a cascading series of questions about the foundations of the cosmos, the morning stars singing together, the gates of death, the storehouses of snow. This response reflects both El's cosmic sovereignty and Yahweh's overwhelming, incomprehensible power. The God of the Job speeches is the creator who was present before Job existed and who governs a cosmos so vast and complex that human beings cannot comprehend its design. This is El as cosmic patriarch, fully identified with Yahweh, explaining to a human being why the scale of divine sovereignty makes the standard human arguments about fairness inapplicable. The wisdom tradition of post-exilic Israel, represented by Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job, and some of the Psalms, also produced one of the most theologically innovative figures in the entire biblical literature, the personification of wisdom, Chokmah in Hebrew. In Proverbs 8, wisdom speaks in the first person as a divine figure who was present with God before creation, who was there when the foundations of the earth were laid, who rejoiced in his creation and delighted in the human race. The language used for wisdom in this passage has close parallels with the language used for Asherah in Canaanite texts, the female divine figure who was El's consort and who shared in his creative activity. the personification of wisdom as a female divine being who participated in the creation and who mediates between God and humanity is, many scholars have argued, a transformation of the Asherah tradition, with Asherah eliminated from the official cult as Yahweh's divine consort. Her characteristics, female divinity, creative partnership with the chief god, mediation between heaven and earth, were reabsorbed into the concept of wisdom, who was no longer an independent goddess, but an attribute or emanation of the single God, feminine in gender, but not an independent divine being. This transformation allowed the wisdom tradition to preserve the feminine divine element that had been such an important part of Israelite religious experience, the nurturing, creative, relational dimension of the divine that Asherah had provided, while remaining within the framework of strict monotheism. The figure of wisdom in Proverbs 8 later became extraordinarily important in early Christian theology, where she was identified with the pre-existent Logos, the divine word who was present at creation and who became incarnate in Jesus, a development that draws on both the wisdom tradition and, more distantly, on the El tradition of cosmic divine creativity. The post-exilic period also saw the emergence of a new kind of literature that would prove enormously influential for later religious history, apocalyptic literature. The Book of Daniel, in its final form probably composed in the 2nd century BCE, during the crisis of the Maccabean period, contains the most developed apocalyptic vision in the Hebrew Bible. A vision of heavenly beings, cosmic warfare, divine judgment, and the ultimate vindication of the righteous. The famous vision of the Ancient of Days in Daniel 7, in which the divine judge appears with white hair and white garments, seated on a fiery throne, with the divine council assembled before him, is one of the most explicit survivals of the El tradition in the entire biblical literature. The description, Ancient of Days, in Aramaic Atik Yomen, is a precise translation of one of El's most characteristic epithets in the Ugaritic texts, where he is called Father of Years or Ancient of Years. The Daniel vision uses this ancient image of El as the divine patriarch judge to frame the apocalyptic drama of the vision. The Ancient of Days sits in judgment, the divine books are opened, and one, like a son of man, a human or human-like figure, approaches the Ancient of Days and is given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. This passage, in which the human figure receives cosmic sovereignty from the divine patriarch, echoes the pattern of the Canaanite divine council, in which the chief god grants authority to the younger divine figure, but now reinterpreted in terms of the vindication of the community of Israel, which is represented by the Son of Man figure. The Son of Man figure in Daniel 7 would become one of the most theologically loaded images in the entire Jewish and Christian tradition. In the New Testament, Jesus uses this title for himself repeatedly and with deliberate reference to the Daniel vision, particularly in the trial scene in the Gospel of Mark, where he tells the high priest, "You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." The language of coming with the clouds echoes Daniel 7 precisely, and behind Daniel 7 is the entire tradition of the divine warrior who rides on the clouds, a title given first to Baal in the Ugaritic texts and then absorbed by Yahweh in the biblical tradition. The genealogy of the Son of Man imagery runs from Baal through Yahweh through Daniel to Jesus, a thread connecting the ancient Canaanite divine warrior to the central Christological title of the Christian tradition. This is not to reduce Jesus to a mythological figure. It is to observe that the religious imagination that produced the Christological titles of the New Testament was drawing on centuries of accumulated religious imagery whose roots ran deep into the Canaanite religious world. The angels of post-exilic Judaism represent another survival and transformation of the ancient divine council, as strict monotheism increasingly insisted that there was only one God and that all other divine beings were either nothing or human fabrications. The problem arose of how to account for the biblical tradition's rich population of divine beings, the sons of God, the divine council, the seraphim, the cherubim, the Watchers, the divine beings who appeared to the patriarchs and prophets. The solution developed in the post-exilic period was to reclass these figures as angels, messengers. The word malach in Hebrew means messenger of the one God, who has no independent divine status of their own, but serve as agents of the divine will. The angelology of the post-exilic and Second Temple period, the elaborate hierarchy of angelic beings with named angels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, each assigned specific cosmic functions, is a transformation of the divine council of the El tradition into a framework compatible with strict monotheism. The members of the divine council are not demoted to the status of nothing. They are reclassified as created beings who serve the one God. Their individual names, Michael, who is like God, Gabriel, man of God, Raphael, God heals, Uriel, God is my light, are all compound with El, the ancient Canaanite divine name, preserving in the very names of the angels the memory of the divine family that El had once presided over as father of the gods. The sons of El became the angels of Yahweh, a transformation that preserved the religious functionality of the divine council while fitting it into the framework of monotheism. The development of angelology was connected to another important post-exilic theological development, the growing sense of divine transcendence and the consequent need for mediating figures between the utterly transcendent God and the human world. In the earlier tradition, Yahweh appeared directly to human beings. He walked in the garden in the cool of the day. He appeared to Abraham at the oak of Mamre. He spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. But as the theological emphasis on divine transcendence increased, as the gap between the infinite, omnipotent creator and finite, fallible human beings grew wider in the theological imagination, direct divine human contact became increasingly problematic, theologically speaking. The angels served as the solution to this problem. They were the intermediaries through whom God communicated with and acted in the human world, preserving the divine transcendence while maintaining the divine-human relationship. The figure of the angel of Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible, who appears in some texts as indistinguishable from Yahweh himself and in others as a clearly distinct messenger, represents an early form of this intermediary theology, and in the full angelology of the post-exilic period, this became an elaborate system of mediation between the divine and human worlds. This development laid the groundwork for the even more elaborate intermediary theologies of later Judaism, the Logos in Philo, the Metatron in mystical literature, and of early Christianity, the incarnate Logos in John, the exalted Christ as divine intermediary in Pauline theology. The post-exilic period, then, was not simply the consolidation of a pre-existing monotheism. It was a period of intense, creative theological work in which the implications of the exile's monotheistic revolution were worked out, debated, and institutionalized. The God who emerged from this period, the God of the Second Temple, of the Torah, of the Psalter, of the wisdom literature, of the prophetic collection, was the God in whom El and Yahweh had been definitively merged, in whom the divine council had been transformed into the angelic hierarchy, in whom Asherah's feminine creativity had been absorbed into the personified wisdom, in whom Baal's storm warrior mythology had become the language of divine sovereignty. He was the one God, creator of all, sovereign of all, transcendent above all, and yet, in the richness of his biblical portrait, he carried within himself the traces of the entire ancient divine world from which he had emerged. The story of how this God was understood, worshipped, and eventually passed on to the wider world, through the diaspora communities of the Persian and Hellenistic periods, through the encounter with Greek philosophy, through the emergence of Christianity and Islam, is the final act of the drama we have been tracing. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire between 334 and 323 BCE and brought the entire Eastern Mediterranean world under the dominion of Greek language and Greek culture, the effect on Judaism was profound, complex, and ultimately world-transforming. The encounter between the God of the Hebrew Bible and the philosophical tradition of ancient Greece, between the personal, covenantal deity of the Torah and the abstract, universal first principle of Greek metaphysics, produced a series of theological syntheses that shaped not only Judaism, but Christianity and eventually Islam. And at the center of this encounter was the question that has been driving our entire investigation: what kind of being is God? Is he the particular deity of a particular people with personal characteristics and emotional responses and a specific history with a specific nation? Or is he the universal ground of all being, the first and final cause of all existence, the unmoved mover who is beyond all particular characteristics and all emotional involvement with the finite world? The answer that the Jewish philosophical tradition eventually produced, that he is both simultaneously without contradiction, is one of the great achievements of the Western religious mind, and it is the culmination of the process that began with El and Yahweh. The Hellenistic period, from Alexander's death in 323 BCE to the Roman conquest, was characterized by intense cultural mixing, what scholars call Hellenization, the spread of Greek language, culture, and intellectual frameworks throughout the conquered world. Jewish communities throughout the Eastern Mediterranean were deeply affected by this cultural environment. The great Jewish community of Alexandria in Egypt, which by the 1st century CE was one of the largest Jewish communities in the diaspora, was so thoroughly Hellenized that its members largely no longer read Hebrew. They used the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, as their primary religious text. The Septuagint itself, produced in stages over the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, was not merely a translation. It was already an interpretive act, rendering the Hebrew religious concepts in Greek terms that inevitably carried philosophical resonances the Hebrew originals did not have. When the Hebrew word Elohim was translated as Theos, God, in Greek, and when Yahweh was translated as Kyrios, Lord, the specific personal covenantal deity of the Hebrew tradition was being located within the framework of Greek religious and philosophical vocabulary, a framework in which the concept of God carried connotations drawn from the rich tradition of Greek philosophical theology. Greek philosophical theology had been developing since the pre-Socratic philosophers of the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, and by the Hellenistic period, it had produced a rich tradition of thought about the nature of the divine. Xenophanes of Colophon, 6th century BCE, had attacked the anthropomorphism of Greek religion, the tendency to imagine the gods in human form with human passions, and argued that the divine must be utterly different from human beings. 1. Eternal, unchanging, all-seeing. Plato, 4th century BCE, had developed a theology in which the highest divine reality, the form of the good, the demiurge, was characterized by perfect unity, rationality, and goodness, utterly transcendent above the material world. Aristotle had developed the concept of the unmoved mover, the first cause of all motion in the universe, itself unmoved, purely actual, engaged in nothing but the contemplation of its own perfection. The Stoics had developed a theology in which the divine was identified with the rational principle, logos, that pervaded and governed the entire cosmos, making the universe itself in some sense divine. All of these philosophical traditions, in their different ways, were developing the concept of a universal, rational, transcendent divine principle, a concept that had significant points of convergence with the monotheism that the Jewish exile tradition had produced, even though the two traditions had arrived at their conclusions by entirely different routes. The first Jewish thinker to engage seriously and systematically with Greek philosophy in the context of Jewish theology was probably the author of the Book of Wisdom, Wisdom of Solomon, a text probably composed in Alexandria in the 1st century BCE or 1st century CE. But the greatest and most influential figure in the Jewish Hellenistic synthesis was Philo of Alexandria, who lived approximately 20 BCE to 50 CE, and who produced a massive body of philosophical and allegorical biblical commentary that attempted to demonstrate the complete compatibility, indeed the essential identity, of the Mosaic tradition with the best of Greek philosophy. Philo's philosophical theology is a remarkable synthesis. He identifies the God of the Hebrew Bible with the transcendent, utterly simple, unknowable first principle of Platonic philosophy, while at the same time preserving the personal, covenantal character of the biblical God through the mediating concept of the Logos. For Philo, the Logos, the divine reason, the first emanation of the supreme God, is the agent through which God creates and governs the world, the mediator between the utterly transcendent God and the finite cosmos. The Logos is the firstborn Son of God, the image of God, the second God, a divine intermediary figure who makes possible the relationship between the transcendent, unknowable divine and the world of human experience. This is, in a very profound sense, the El tradition reconceived in Platonic terms. El, the divine patriarch whose children mediate between the cosmic divine council and the human world, has become the Platonic first principle whose Logos mediates between the infinite divine and the finite world. Philo's Logos theology had enormous consequences for the development of Christianity. The prologue of the Gospel of John: "In the beginning was the Word, Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made," is written in direct dialogue with the Philonic Logos tradition, and the identification of Jesus with the Logos represents the Christian appropriation of the Jewish Hellenistic synthesis. The claim that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us is the Christian answer to the problem of divine transcendence and divine immanence, the problem that Philo had tried to solve with his Logos theology. If God is utterly transcendent, how can he be personally related to human beings? The Christian answer: he becomes human, taking on flesh, making the ultimate condescension from infinite to finite. The El tradition, in which the Divine Father appears personally to human beings and enters into relationships with them, has found its ultimate expression in the Christian doctrine of the Incarnation, though now the mediating figure is not an abstract Logos, but a specific historical person. The encounter with Greek philosophy also reshaped the theological language available for discussing the God of the Bible in ways that have permanently shaped Western religious thought. The concept of divine simplicity, the idea that God has no parts, no composition, no complexity, that he is absolutely one, was developed by the medieval Jewish philosopher Maimonides, Rambam, 1135 to 1204 CE, on the basis of the Aristotelian tradition. For Maimonides, God's absolute unity and simplicity means that all predicates applied to God, good, wise, powerful, existing, are not descriptions of attributes that God possesses, but rather negations. God is not evil, not ignorant, not weak, not non-existent. Positive descriptions of God necessarily distort his nature because they impose finite categories on an infinite reality. The only true theological language, for Maimonides, is the language of negative theology, the via negativa, which approaches the divine by saying what God is not rather than what he is. This radical theological apophysis, which Maimonides developed in his Guide for the Perplexed, is the philosophical culmination of the trajectory we have been tracing, from the richly personal, emotionally vivid deity of the early biblical tradition, both El and Yahweh, to the utterly transcendent, utterly unknowable, divine first principle of philosophical theology. The El who wept for Baal's death and appeared to Carrot in dreams has become the Maimonidean necessary existent, about whom nothing can be positively predicated. The distance traveled is almost unimaginable, and yet there is a continuous thread of theological development connecting the 2 points. The other great development of the Hellenistic period that bears on our story is the consolidation of the Hebrew biblical canon, the process by which the various texts that make up the Hebrew Bible were collected, edited, and accepted as authoritative scripture was a long one, and it was not complete until several centuries into the Common Era. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, was probably the first section to be accepted as authoritative, sometime in the 5th or 4th century BCE. The prophets, Nevi'im, were probably canonized somewhat later, and the writings, Ketuvim, were the last to be fixed, with debates about specific books, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Esther, continuing into the rabbinic period. The canonization of the Hebrew Bible was not simply a matter of collecting existing texts. It involved decisions about which texts were authoritative and which were not, about which religious traditions were legitimate and which were deviant, and about how the different and sometimes contradictory theological perspectives within the collected texts were to be harmonized or held in tension. The decisions made in the canonization process shaped the religious tradition for all subsequent time by including certain texts, Psalm 82 with its divine counsel, Daniel 7 with its Ancient of Days, Job with its divine court scene, and excluding others, the Book of Enoch, for instance, with its elaborate mythology of fallen angels, included in the Ethiopian Church's canon, but excluded from the Hebrew Bible and eventually from the Christian Old Testament. The canonical process both preserved and filtered the rich diversity of the older religious world. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that became the Bible of the early church, made another set of decisions that proved enormously consequential. In translating the Hebrew divine names into Greek, the Septuagint consistently rendered Elohim as Theos and Yahweh as Kyrios, Lord, a translation convention that had the effect of making the personal name of Israel's God nearly invisible in the Greek text. The erasure of the Tetragrammaton from the text of Scripture was a process that, beginning in the Hellenistic period, eventually resulted in the complete abandonment of the name Yahweh in Jewish religious use, replaced first by Adonai, Lord, in Hebrew, and Kyrios, Lord, in Greek, and eventually by various circumlocutions, Hashem, the name, Hamakom, the place. The reasons for this development are complex, a combination of reverence for the divine name, the practical reality that most Hellenistic Jews did not know how to pronounce it, and possibly the theological sensibility that the unique personal name of the God who had been identified with the universal divine principle should not be reduced to something as particular and pronounceable as a personal name. Whatever the reasons, the practical effect was that the specific, personal, historically particular God of the Hebrew Bible became, in the Hellenistic Jewish context, a more abstract, more universal, more philosophically formulated divine reality, Theos, the God, rather than Yahweh, the personal name. This shift in divine nomenclature had profound consequences for the way subsequent generations understood the God of the Bible. For readers of the Septuagint, which is to say, for virtually all early Christians and for the Hellenistic Jewish communities of the diaspora, the God of the Old Testament was God, Theos, and Lord, Kyrios, universal designations rather than personal names. The particularity of Yahweh, his origins in the southern desert, his identification with the wilderness mountain, his specific covenantal history with Israel, his merger with El, was invisible to most readers of the Greek text. What they saw was a universal divine being, one in kind with the Theos of philosophical theology, who had chosen to relate himself to the world through the specific history narrated in the Jewish scriptures. This is the God, Theos, Kyrios, who was preached by Paul in the synagogues and marketplaces of the Mediterranean world, and who became, through the missionary activity of the early church, the God of the Western world. The development of Christianity out of Second Temple Judaism is itself one of the most dramatic episodes in the history of religion, and it bears directly on our story because early Christianity made a series of theological decisions that significantly altered the inherited portrait of the God of the Hebrew Bible. The most important of these decisions was the development of Trinitarian theology, the doctrine that the one God exists in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Trinitarian theology emerged gradually over the first 4 centuries of the Christian era through a complex process of theological debate, heretical challenge, and conciliar decision. Its roots lie in the New Testament's treatment of Jesus as divine, a treatment that was already extraordinary within a Jewish monotheistic framework, and in the Hellenistic Jewish concept of the Logos as divine mediator. But in its fully developed form, Trinitarian theology represents another transformation of the ancient divine council tradition. The one God who is three is a kind of divine community, a structure of divine relationships that preserves something of the relational character of the Canaanite divine family, El and Asherah and their divine offspring, within the framework of strict monotheism. The Father, who is explicitly identified in the New Testament with the Ancient of Days, the El figure of Daniel 7, the Son who is the divine Logos made flesh, and the Spirit who is the dynamic divine presence in the world. This Trinitarian structure preserves the relational richness of the polytheistic divine family while insisting on its absolute unity. It is, in the deepest sense, the final chapter of the story that began with El and his divine council sitting on the mountain at the source of the rivers. The emergence of Islam in the 7th century CE brought yet another engagement with the divine inheritance of the ancient Near East. Muhammad's proclamation of the absolute unity of God, expressed in the Shahada, "There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger," was at once a rejection of the Trinity, understood as a form of polytheism, and an affirmation of the deepest theological insight of the Jewish monotheistic tradition, that there is only one ultimate divine reality, the creator and sovereign of all existence. The Arabic word for God, Allah, is itself the direct linguistic descendant of the ancient Semitic El through al-Ilah, the God. The absolute unity of God in Islamic theology, the concept of Tawhid, divine oneness, is the most radical possible form of the anti-polytheism that the prophets of ancient Israel had advocated, taken to its logical extreme. Islam eliminated not only the polytheism of the ancient Near East, but also the functional polytheism that Islamic theology saw in the Christian Trinity and in the veneration of saints. The one God of Islam is the direct heir of the monotheistic revolution of 2nd Isaiah, the El Yahweh synthesis taken to its most austere and uncompromising conclusion. What is remarkable, surveying this entire development from the ancient Canaanite divine council to the Islamic Tawhid, is the degree to which the core theological insights of the ancient Near Eastern El tradition were preserved even as the specific forms of the religion changed beyond recognition. The cosmic sovereignty of the divine patriarch, his role as creator of all created things, his compassion toward humanity, his justice and his mercy, his governance of the cosmos through a structured hierarchy of divine and angelic beings, his personal involvement in human history. All of these features of the ancient Canaanite El were absorbed into the biblical Yahweh, and through Yahweh into the God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The specific religious forms, the temple cult, the sacrificial system, the specific covenantal relationship with Israel, changed radically as the traditions developed, but the core portrait of the divine remained, in essential ways, recognizable across the enormous distance from the mountain of El in ancient Ugarit to the mosques and churches and synagogues of the modern world. What remains? The traces of El in the modern world. The question of what remains of El in the modern religious world is not merely an archaeological or historical curiosity. It goes to the heart of what any living religious tradition is and how it works, how the past is preserved in the present, how ancient meanings survive in modern forms, how the traces of a suppressed or transformed religious world continue to shape the consciousness of people who have no awareness of those traces. El is everywhere in the modern religious world, hiding in plain sight, in the names people call God, in the prayers they recite, in the theological concepts they take for granted, in the stories they regard as foundational to their faith. To see El in these modern contexts is not to diminish the faith that has grown from these traditions. It is to see that faith in its full historical depth, to understand it as the product of a long and rich process of religious evolution, rather than as something that sprang fully formed from a divine revelation with no prior history. The depth of this history adds to the wonder of the tradition, not subtract from it. The most obvious surviving trace of El in the modern religious world is in the divine names themselves. The name Allah in Arabic, the name of God in Islam, used by over 1 billion people every day in their prayers, is directly derived from al-Ilah, a contraction of the Arabic definite article al and the word Ilah, God, which is the direct descendant of the ancient Semitic El. When a Muslim says, Allahu Akbar, God is great, the word at the heart of that declaration traces its linguistic ancestry directly back to the ancient Canaanite divine patriarch. The Hebrew El appears in the Jewish divine names Elohim and El Shaddai, still in use in Jewish prayer and liturgy today. The Christian word God itself, while of Germanic rather than Semitic origin, is used to translate both the Hebrew El and the Greek Theos, so that when a Christian speaks of God, they are invoking a concept that was shaped in large part by the El tradition of ancient Canaan and its theological development through the Hebrew Bible. The titles used for God in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic tradition also carry the El tradition's DNA. The title Most High, El Elyon in Hebrew, Theos Hypsistos in Greek, Al-Allah in Arabic, is one of El's most ancient epithets in the Ugaritic texts, and it appears in all three Abrahamic traditions as a standard title for God. The concept of God as Father, perhaps the most widely used relational term for the divine in Christianity, Our Father, who art in heaven, and also present in Jewish and Islamic prayer, is directly derived from El's character as the divine patriarch, the Ab-Ilm, Father of the gods, and Ab-Adm, Father of humanity, of the Ugaritic texts. The compassion formula that runs through all three Abrahamic traditions, merciful and gracious, full of steadfast love in Judaism and Christianity, Al-Rahman Al-Rahim, the compassionate, the merciful, in Islam, invoked at the beginning of every chapter of the Quran, reflects El's character as LTPN, the kindly one, the compassionate divine Father, whose mercy is as fundamental to his character as his power. El's compassion, absorbed into Yahweh's character through the great synthesis, has become the opening note of every Muslim prayer. The concept of the divine council, so central to El's world and so clearly present in the oldest layers of the Hebrew Bible, did not disappear from monotheistic religion. It was transformed. In Judaism, the divine council became the heavenly court, the Bet Din Shel Ma'ala, the celestial tribunal that corresponds to the earthly court and whose judgments are sealed on Yom Kippur, the liturgy of the high holy days, particularly the Unetani Tokef prayer, which speaks of God sitting in judgment and inscribing the fate of each person in the book of life, is built around the concept of a divine court scene that goes back directly to El's role as cosmic judge in the Ugaritic tradition. In Christianity, the divine council became the angelic hierarchy, the ranks of seraphim, cherubim, thrones, dominions, principalities, powers, archangels, and angels that appear in the letters of Paul and in the book of Revelation, and that were systematized in the theological tradition of Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite. These 9 orders of angels, which became a standard feature of medieval Christian cosmology, are the direct descendants of the sons of El, who made up the divine family in the Ugaritic texts, demoted from divine status to created status, reclassified from independent deities to servants of the one God, but otherwise performing essentially the same cosmological functions as their ancient predecessors. The figure of Satan, the devil, the adversary, the prince of darkness who plays such an enormous role in popular Christian religious imagination, is another transformed descendant of the divine council tradition. We saw earlier that in the book of Job, the Ha-Satan, the accuser, is a member of Yahweh's heavenly court, one of the sons of God who presents himself before the divine throne. In later Second Temple Jewish literature, particularly in texts like War Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, this figure underwent a remarkable transformation from a heavenly prosecutor with a legitimate juridical function to a cosmic rebel, a fallen divine being who had rejected God's authority and was now leading a cosmic opposition against the divine order. This transformation of the Ha-Satan from a member of the divine court to a cosmic antagonist may have been influenced by Persian religious ideas about cosmic dualism, the struggle between Ahura Mazda and Ahriman, light and darkness, good and evil, which were encountered during the Babylonian exile. The developed figure of Satan in the New Testament, the ruler of this world, the prince of the power of the air, the one who fell like lightning from heaven, is a theological hybrid, part divine council member, part cosmic rebel, part personification of the forces of chaos and disorder that threatened the divine order from outside. His persistence in popular religious imagination reflects the persistence of the ancient Near Eastern sense that the cosmos is not a simple, harmonious place, but a contested arena where divine and anti-divine forces engage in struggle, a sense that strict monotheism has never been entirely able to eliminate. The theology of the covenant, which is absolutely central to the Jewish tradition and significantly present in Christian and Islamic theology as well, is another inheritance from the ancient Near Eastern world in which El operated. The idea that the supreme deity would enter into a binding, formal relationship with a human community, promising protection and blessing in exchange for loyalty and obedience, is rooted in the ancient Near Eastern tradition of treaty and covenant making, in which the pattern of suzerain vassal treaties, agreements between great kings and their subordinate peoples, was applied to the relationship between the divine and human worlds. But the character of the covenant, its emphasis on the divine commitment to a specific people, on the divine promise of presence and protection, on the paternal care of the divine sovereign for his human community, reflects the El tradition's understanding of the relationship between the divine patriarch and his children, scaled from the divine family to the human covenant community. The covenant theology of the Hebrew Bible is, in a profound sense, the El tradition's paternal divine-human relationship formalized and institutionalized into the theological framework that would define Judaism for 3,000 years. The wisdom tradition, the strand of biblical and post-biblical thought represented by Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, Sirach, and Wisdom of Solomon, also carries deep traces of the El tradition. El was, above all, the god of wisdom in the Canaanite tradition, the wise counselor, the deliberate and thoughtful divine patriarch who governed by wisdom rather than by force. His epithet, the wise, appears in the Ugaritic texts alongside his other titles, and his governance of the divine council was characterized precisely by the wisdom and discernment with which he made his judgments. The biblical tradition's emphasis on divine wisdom, its development of wisdom, Chokmah, as a divine attribute, its equation of wisdom with the fear of God, its vision of creation as an act of divine wisdom, all of this reflects the inheritance from El, the wise divine patriarch whose wisdom was the principle of cosmic order. The Christian theological tradition's identification of Christ with the wisdom of God, Paul's description of Christ as the wisdom of God and the power of God in 1 Corinthians, draws on this same tradition, as does the identification of Christ with the Logos, the rational principle of the cosmos, in Johannine theology. The sacred geography of the monotheistic traditions also carries traces of the El world. The concept of the sacred mountain, the place where heaven and earth meet, where the divine is most intensely present, where the definitive divine encounters with humanity take place, runs from El's cosmic mountain through Sinai and Zion and the Temple Mount, through the Christian concept of Golgotha as the navel of the earth to the Islamic concept of the Kaaba in Mecca as the earthly counterpart of the divine throne. The traditions of pilgrimage, Jews facing Jerusalem in prayer, Christians making pilgrimages to the Holy Land, Muslims performing the Hajj to Mecca, all reflect the ancient intuition that there are specific places where the divine is more accessible, more present, more potent than in ordinary space. This spatial understanding of the divine, utterly transcendent and yet specially present in specific sacred places, is not philosophically coherent within strict monotheism, but it survives in all three traditions precisely because the ancient sense of sacred place, rooted in the El tradition of local divine presence at specific sanctuaries, is too deeply embedded in human religious experience to be eliminated by theological argument. The liturgical and prayer traditions of the Abrahamic faiths are similarly full of El's traces. The Jewish Amidah, the central prayer of the daily liturgy, also called the Shemoneh Esrei, or 18 benedictions, opens with 3 blessings that explicitly invoke El's characteristics. God as the God of the patriarchs, the Avot blessing, which remembers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the God who appeared to them. God as the mighty divine warrior who brings rain and sustains life, the Jevuro blessing, and God as the Holy One, the Kedushah, reflecting the holiness traditions of the temple cult. The Avot blessing specifically says that God remembered the pious acts of the patriarchs and will bring a redeemer to their children's children for his name's sake, with love, a theological claim rooted in the covenant relationship between El and the patriarchal ancestors, now attributed to Yahweh and extended into the eschatological future. The Christian Lord's Prayer, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven, invokes the divine patriarch, El, as Father, the sacred name, Yahweh, whose name is holy, the divine sovereignty, El's cosmic governance of the divine council, and the eschatological hope of the fully realized divine reign. The Islamic Fatiha, the opening chapter of the Quran, recited 17 times daily in the 5 daily prayers, invokes Allah, the Compassionate, the Merciful, El's character as LTPN, the Kindly One, the Master of the Day of Judgment, El's character as Cosmic Judge, and calls for guidance on the straight path. In each of these foundational prayers, the ancient characteristics of El, compassion, paternal care, cosmic justice, universal sovereignty, shine through the language of the developed monotheistic tradition. The academic discipline of biblical archaeology, which has done so much to recover the pre-monotheistic religious world that the Bible's editors tried to suppress, has itself generated a kind of controversy in popular religious culture that is worth acknowledging. When archaeologists report that female figurines were found in Israelite domestic contexts, or that inscriptions pairing Yahweh with Asherah have been found, or that the temple in Jerusalem apparently housed cult objects associated with multiple divine figures, the response from traditionally minded believers is often one of alarm or rejection. The claim that Israelite religion was diverse and syncretic, that the God of the Bible emerged from a process of religious evolution rather than revelation, is experienced by many believers as an attack on the truth of their faith. This is understandable, but it reflects a misunderstanding of what the historical evidence actually implies. The historical evidence does not say anything about whether God exists, or whether divine revelation is real, or whether the theological claims of Judaism or Christianity or Islam are true. What it says is that the human understanding of God, the concepts, the language, the practices, the institutions through which human beings have tried to relate to whatever is ultimate, has evolved over time, been shaped by historical circumstances, absorbed influences from multiple cultural sources, and reached its present form through a long and complex process. This is entirely consistent with the theological claim that God is real and that he reveals himself through historical processes, that the evolution of religious understanding is itself a form of divine self-disclosure, working through the full complexity of human cultural history rather than in spite of it. The traces of El in the modern world are not embarrassments to be explained away. They are evidence of the remarkable continuity of the human religious imagination, of the persistence of certain fundamental intuitions about the nature of the divine across thousands of years and hundreds of cultural transformations. The sense that the divine is ultimately one, that it is the source of all existence and the ground of all order, that it is compassionate and just, that it is accessible to human beings through specific acts of communication and specific places of encounter, that it governs the cosmos through a structured hierarchy of powers, that it cares particularly about justice and mercy and the welfare of the vulnerable. These intuitions appear in El's world, and they appear in the modern monotheistic traditions, because they are the fundamental insights of the human encounter with the divine, shaped and expressed differently in different cultural contexts, but identifiable as the same core experience across the millennia. El, the Father of gods and men, has become, through the long process of religious evolution we have been tracing, the one God of the Abrahamic faiths. But in becoming that one God, he has lost nothing essential: his compassion, his justice, his wisdom, his cosmic sovereignty, his paternal care for humanity. All of these survive, transformed but recognizable, in the God that billions of people worship today. The question that this entire investigation raises, and that cannot be avoided, is what it means for the practice of faith in the modern world to know this history. What does it mean to pray to a God whose name and character are the product of a long historical synthesis? What does it mean to recite prayers and perform rituals that carry within them the traces of a religious world that the later tradition condemned as idolatrous? There is no single answer to this question, and the answer will be different for different people, depending on their theological commitments and their understanding of the relationship between history and revelation. But one answer that many thoughtful believers in all three traditions have found compelling is this: the history of the God of the Bible is not a history of human invention, but a history of divine self-disclosure through the human religious imagination. The God who is revealed in and through the complex, evolving, culturally conditioned process of Israelite religion is no less real for being revealed through that process, any more than the physical world is less real for being the product of a long evolutionary process. The question of divine reality is not decided by the historical complexity of the traditions that testify to it. It is decided by the encounter with whatever is ultimate. And that encounter, which the El tradition described in terms of the ancient divine patriarch, and which the later traditions describe in the language of Yahweh's covenant love and second Isaiah's universal sovereignty, is as real and as accessible to modern human beings as it was to the Canaanite worshippers who first named their divine father El and gathered on their sacred mountains to offer him their devotion. The full picture, what really happened. We have traveled an enormous distance in this investigation, from the discovery of clay tablets at Ugarit in 1929 to the theology of Maimonides, from the mountain of El at the source of the rivers to the mosques and churches and synagogues of the modern world, from the Shasu nomads of the Egyptian inscriptions who worshipped a deity called YHW to the billions of people today who call on that same deity under the names God, Yahweh, Allah, Adonai, and Lord. It is time now to draw the threads together, to give the clearest possible account of what really happened, of how El became Yahweh and Yahweh became the God of the Bible, of the mechanisms and the timeline and the driving forces of this extraordinary religious transformation. And it is time to ask what this history means, not just historically, but philosophically and existentially, for our understanding of who God is and how human beings have related to the divine throughout history. Let us begin with the clearest possible statement of the historical reconstruction, setting aside for a moment the qualifications and debates that surround each element of it. In the beginning, which is to say, in the late Bronze Age, roughly 1500 to 1200 BCE, and in the period immediately before, the religious world of Canaan was presided over by El, the ancient divine patriarch, the father of gods and men. El was the supreme deity of the Canaanite pantheon, the creator of all created things, the wise and compassionate divine father who governed the cosmos from his mountain throne through the divine counsel of his divine children. He was worshipped across the entire Western Semitic world under various local names and epithets. El Elyon, El Shaddai, El Olam, El Bethel, and his characteristics included cosmic sovereignty, creative power, juridical authority, and paternal compassion. The ancestors of the Israelites, the semi-nomadic and pastoral peoples who eventually coalesced into the tribes of Israel in the central highlands of Canaan, worshipped El as their primary deity. The patriarchal narratives of Genesis preserve the memory of this worship. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob received divine revelations at ancient El sanctuaries under El names, entered into covenant relationships with the divine Father, and were promised land and descendants in a relationship modeled on El's paternal care for his human children. At the same time, somewhere in the wilderness regions south of Canaan, in the Sinai, in Edom, in Midian, in the land of the Kenites, a deity named Yahweh was being worshipped by the nomadic peoples of the desert. Yahweh's origins are obscure, but the evidence points to his being a deity of storm and fire and earthquake, a warrior god of the southern wilderness, possibly originally worshipped by the Kenites and related Midianite groups before being introduced to the emerging Israelite confederation through the figure of Moses and the traditions associated with the wilderness period and the Exodus. The geographical references in the oldest biblical poetry locate Yahweh's home in the south, Sinai, Seir, Paran, Teman, Edom, and the Egyptian references to the land of the Shasu of YHW provide independent confirmation that the name Yahweh was associated with the southern desert peoples at least a century before the traditional date of the Exodus. The key historical moment in the story, the moment when El and Yahweh began to be identified with each other, was probably the period of the emergence of the Israelite tribal confederation in the 12th and 11th centuries BCE, as groups of different cultural and geographic origins coalesced into the entity we call Israel. Highland Canaanites, desert nomads, possibly a group with experience of Egypt, their different divine traditions were brought together. The El-worshipping Highlanders and the Yahweh-worshipping desert nomads, or the Israelites who had adopted Yahweh from the Kenites, needed to integrate their religious traditions, and the natural solution was the identification of their respective divine figures as the same being. This identification was facilitated by the fact that El was, in the Canaanite tradition, the ultimate divine patriarch. Any deity could in principle be understood as a manifestation or local form of El, just as any woman could be understood as a manifestation of Asherah or any storm god as a form of Baal. Yahweh was assimilated into the El tradition. He took on El's epithets: Most High, Creator of created things, Father of the gods. His mythology, the cosmic council, the mountain abode, the covenant with humanity, his iconography, the bull symbol at Bethel, and his theological character, compassion, paternal care, cosmic justice. El's devotees became Yahweh's devotees, not because they were converted to a new religion, but because they came to understand that the God they had always worshipped as El was the same being their colleagues worshipped as Yahweh. The process of identification was not instantaneous and was not without tensions. The priestly and Elohist traditions preserved the memory that the patriarchs had worshipped under a different name, that El and Yahweh had once been separate, while the Yahwist tradition proceeded as though the identification had always been complete. The divine council tradition, the Asherah worship, the multiple local manifestations of Yahweh, the bull iconography at Bethel and Dan, all of these reflect a period in which the El-Yahweh synthesis was still in process, in which the characteristics and worship patterns of the older El tradition coexisted with the newer Yahweh dominant synthesis. This period corresponds roughly to the period of the Judges and the early monarchy, the 11th through 9th centuries BCE, in which the religious landscape of Israel was genuinely diverse, and in which the exclusive Yahwism that would eventually prevail was only one tendency among many. The period of the monarchy, particularly the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, saw the El-Yahweh synthesis being driven in the direction of increasing Yahweh dominance by two complementary forces: the prophetic tradition, which championed exclusive Yahwism as the authentic expression of the Sinai covenant, and the political program of the Davidic monarchy in Jerusalem, which associated the divine legitimacy of the Davidic dynasty with the exclusive worship of Yahweh at the Jerusalem temple. The classical prophets, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Micah, articulated the theological case for exclusive Yahwism with increasing force and sophistication, borrowing the mythological and theological language of Baal and El to build a portrait of Yahweh as the universal divine sovereign who claimed the exclusive allegiance of all Israel. Josiah's reform in the late 7th century BCE represented the most ambitious attempt to institutionalize this exclusive Yahwism, to eliminate, by royal decree and military enforcement, all the alternative religious practices that had coexisted with Yahwism throughout the monarchy period. The reform was partially successful, but it was cut short by Josiah's death at the Battle of Megiddo in 609 BCE, and the evidence from Jeremiah and the archaeological record suggests that the old religious diversity reasserted itself almost immediately after Josiah's death. The Babylonian exile of 587–538 BCE was the decisive turning point. The destruction of the temple and the deportation of the elite created the crisis that forced the final, definitive theological resolution, the proclamation of radical monotheism by 2nd Isaiah. In 2nd Isaiah, the process that had been underway for centuries reached its culmination. Yahweh absorbed not only the character of El, but the entire divine cosmos. All functions, all powers, all cosmic domains were attributed to him alone. The other gods were declared to be nothing. The divine council was dissolved, or rather, transformed into a court of angels who were created beings serving the one God. Asherah was eliminated, or rather, her creative partnership with the divine was absorbed into the concept of divine wisdom. Baal's storm mythology was definitively attributed to Yahweh, his role as rain-giver and fertility god transferred to the one God who controlled all weather and all fertility. The multiple divine presences of the ancient Near East were collapsed into a single, all-encompassing divine reality. This was the birth of the God who is today worshipped by over half of the world's population. The post-exilic period consolidated this monotheistic revolution and institutionalized it in the Torah, the Second Temple, and the developing tradition of rabbinic interpretation. The Hellenistic encounter gave the monotheistic God a philosophical vocabulary. The language of the One, the transcendent, the necessary being, the first cause, that allowed him to be expressed in terms intelligible to the Greek intellectual world. Early Christianity transformed the God of Israel into the God of the entire Roman Empire, first through Paul's missionary activity and then through the adoption of Christianity as the official religion of the empire under Constantine. Islam, emerging 6 centuries after Christianity, proclaimed the absolute unity of this same God in the most rigorous theological terms, eliminating even the qualified multiplicity of the Christian Trinity and insisting on the absolute simplicity and unity of the divine reality. Through these 3 great traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the God who began as El, the Canaanite divine patriarch, became the God of the Western world, and eventually, through Western expansion and missionary activity, the God worshipped on every continent and in every nation on earth. What does this history mean? There are several ways to answer this question, and they are not mutually exclusive. From a purely historical perspective, it means that the God of the Western world is the product of a specific regional religious tradition, the tradition of the ancient Near East and Canaan, and that his characteristics, his mythology, his theological profile, and his institutional forms all bear the marks of that specific historical origin. He is not a universal constant that all cultures have independently discovered. He is a historically particular development, shaped by specific cultures, specific events, specific intellectual and social forces. This is a significant claim, and it has implications for how we understand the relationship between the Abrahamic God and the divine figures of other religious traditions, the Brahman of Hinduism, the Tao of Taoism, the Dharmakaya of Buddhism, the divine as understood in indigenous traditions around the world. If the God of the Bible is a historically particular development rather than the universal form of the divine, then the question of how this particular historical deity relates to other historically particular divine figures becomes more complex and more interesting than the traditional claim of any one tradition that it alone has the true and complete understanding of God. From a theological perspective, the perspective of those who believe that the God who emerged from this historical process is real, the history means something different. It means that the divine self-disclosure is not accomplished through a single dramatic revelation that bypasses history, but through a sustained engagement with human religious experience across centuries and cultures. The God who appears at the end of this process as the one God of the 3 Abrahamic traditions has been revealing himself progressively, first as El, the divine patriarch of the Canaanite world, then as Yahweh, the warrior deity of the desert south, then as the merged El Yahweh, the God of the Israelite tribes, then as the universal, exclusive deity of the prophetic tradition, then as the absolute, philosophical first principle of the Hellenistic synthesis, and finally, in each of the Abrahamic traditions, in the specific forms appropriate to those traditions' particular theological insights and cultural contexts. This is not deception or confusion. It is the irreducible complexity of the divine encounter with finite human beings, who can only grasp the infinite gradually and partially through the specific cultural forms and historical experiences available to them. The El of the Ugaritic texts and the Allah of the Quran and the Trinity of Christian theology are not, from this perspective, contradictory claims. They are different stages in an ongoing process of divine self-disclosure, each appropriate to its specific historical context, each preserving something essential while necessarily leaving something else for a later stage of the revelation to articulate. There is a third perspective that deserves mention, one that belongs neither to pure history nor to committed theology, the perspective of those who approach this material as students of the human religious imagination, fascinated by the extraordinary creativity and persistence with which human beings have constructed meaningful frameworks for understanding their place in the cosmos. From this perspective, what is most remarkable about the story of El and Yahweh is the sheer audacity of the synthesis that was achieved, the transformation of a rich, complex, multivalent, polytheistic religious world into a strict, demanding, philosophically rigorous monotheism, accomplished not through violent suppression of the older tradition, but through its creative absorption and transformation. The ancient El, Father of gods and men, sitting on his mountain at the source of the rivers, was not destroyed by monotheism. He was incorporated into it, became the foundation of it, persists within it. His wisdom, his compassion, his cosmic sovereignty, his paternal relationship with humanity, all of these survive in the God who is worshipped today, 3,000 years after El's name was last carved on a Canaanite altar. That is, by any measure, an extraordinary achievement of the religious imagination. The practical implication of this history for how we read and understand the Bible is equally significant. When we read the Bible knowing that the God it describes is the product of a long synthesis, when we hear the Lord and know that behind that title stands both El and Yahweh, both the compassionate Father God of the Canaanite highlands and the fierce warrior deity of the desert south, when we read the Psalms that celebrate Yahweh riding on the clouds and recognize the Baal mythology that underlies that image. When we encounter Psalm 82 with its divine assembly and know that we are looking at a transformed version of El's divine counsel, we read with a richer and more nuanced understanding than if we read simply on the surface. We read the Bible as the complex, layered, historically situated document it actually is. A document that preserves the traces of multiple religious worlds within its pages, that contains tensions and contradictions and developments that are the marks of a living tradition wrestling with itself across centuries. This kind of reading does not undermine the Bible's theological authority. For those who accept that authority, it deepens it by revealing how much of the full complexity of human religious experience is contained within the text. The story of El and Yahweh is also, finally, a story about identity, about how peoples and traditions construct and maintain their identity through religious narrative. The insistence on exclusive Yahwism, on the singularity and uniqueness of Israel's God, was not merely a theological position, it was an identity claim, a statement about who the Israelites were and how they differed from the other peoples of the ancient Near East. The long struggle to establish this exclusive identity, the prophets' wars against Baal, the Deuteronomic reform, the exile's transformation into a theological watershed, the post-exilic construction of a Torah-centered community, was a struggle to define and defend a distinctive religious identity in the face of constant pressure toward assimilation into the surrounding culture. The God who emerged from this struggle, the one God utterly unique, demanding exclusive loyalty, the source of all ethics and all meaning, was simultaneously a theological claim and an identity marker, a way of saying, we are a people defined by our relationship with this God, a people who stand in a specific and unique relationship to the ultimate ground of reality. This identity claim and the religious tradition built around it proved remarkably durable. Surviving the Babylonian exile, the Hellenistic pressure to assimilate into Greek culture, the Roman destruction of the temple in 70 CE, 2 millennia of diaspora, and the catastrophe of the Holocaust. The God who absorbed El's characteristics and emerged as the sole divine reality also absorbed something of El's durability, the ancient divine patriarch's quality of persistence across all upheavals, of surviving the death of one religious world and living on into the next. El sat on his mountain at the source of the rivers, surrounded by his divine family, governing the cosmos with the wisdom of the eternal patriarch. The world he presided over was swept away, his divine family dismantled, his consort absorbed or eliminated, his sons demoted to angels or to nothing, his sanctuaries destroyed or rededicated, his name reduced to a title. And yet El survived, not as a distinct divine figure, but as the hidden foundation of the God who replaced him. Every prayer addressed to the Most High, every invocation of the compassionate Divine Father, every meditation on the cosmic wisdom that undergirds the created order, every act of worship that approaches the ultimate through the lens of justice and mercy and steadfast love. In all of these, the ancient divine patriarch is present, hidden in the foundations of the tradition that thought it had left him behind. The Father of gods and men, the Creator of created things, the kindly one, he is still there, speaking through the traditions that bear his inheritance, still the foundation beneath the foundation, the oldest God in the Western world. The story of how Yahweh became the God of the Bible is, at its deepest level, the story of how human beings learn to think about the divine. It is a story of progressive discovery and progressive synthesis, of taking what was partial and local and particular and expanding it through centuries of religious experience and intellectual reflection toward the universal and the transcendent. It is a story in which each generation built on what the previous generation had discovered, absorbed what was essential from the wider culture while rejecting what was incompatible with the core insight, and handed on to the next generation a richer and more comprehensive understanding of the divine than it had received. Whether you understand this as a purely human process of religious evolution or as the record of a genuine divine self-disclosure working through human history, the story itself, the long journey from El to Yahweh to the God of the Bible, is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of human civilization. It is the story of the West's God, and to know it is to know something essential about who we are and where we came from. The ancient texts are still speaking. The clay tablets of Ugarit, pressed with cuneiform signs 33 centuries ago, still tell us about El sitting at his mountain with Asherah beside him, and the sons of God gathered at his feet. The bronze figurines of Canaan, dug from the earth by archaeologists with careful brushes, still show us the bull-horned divine patriarch who was the original father of the Western God. The inscriptions at Kuntilat Ajrud, scratched onto pottery jars by travelers in the Sinai desert 28 centuries ago, still speak of Yahweh and his Asherah, a divine couple whose relationship the later tradition suppressed but could not entirely erase. The poetic fragments embedded in the oldest layers of the Hebrew Bible, the Song of Deborah, the Song of Moses, the Blessing of Moses, the archaic Psalms, still resonate with the world of the ancient Near East that produced them, still carry within themselves the memory of the divine world from which the God of the Bible emerged. To read these texts with attention is to hear, beneath the surface of the later tradition, the older voices that gave the tradition its depth and its richness. El, the Father of gods and men, speaking through the words that have been put in Yahweh's mouth, still addressing the human world with the wisdom and compassion of the original divine patriarch. And Yahweh, the fierce, fiery, demanding, passionate desert deity, the God who chose one people and bound himself to them through covenant, the God who brought them out of Egypt and through the wilderness and into the land, the God who raised up prophets to call them back when they strayed and who punished them when they would not listen, but who always, always refused to let them go. Yahweh too is still speaking through all the layers of his tradition, through the Torah and the prophets and the writings, through the rabbinic tradition and the Christian scriptures and the Quran. He is speaking in the language of demanding love, the love of the God who will not be satisfied with half measures, who insists that justice and mercy and faithfulness are not optional extras, but the very heart of what it means to be human, who announces his own character in the words that have rung across 30 centuries like a bell struck at the center of the world, merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. That God, the synthesis of El and Yahweh, the product of the ancient Near East and the desert south, of the Canaanite highlands and the wilderness of Sinai, of the royal palaces of Jerusalem and the rivers of Babylon, of the philosophical schools of Alexandria, and the prophetic fires of the Israelite countryside. That God is still, for billions of people, the ultimate reality around which their lives are organized and their deepest hopes are structured. His history is long, and it is human, and it is full of the complexity and conflict and gradual hard-won insight that characterizes the best of human achievement. And it is, for those willing to see it whole, one of the most magnificent stories ever told. This has been the story of how Yahweh became the God of the Bible and what happened to El. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.